Gentlemen, I hope I'm going live about now. We do have a very interesting video today. I'm not talking about myself in pluralis majestatis. I am just saying we all as a community with hopefully very lively live chat. We already have some absolute champs joining the stream. I hope we can have a lot of interaction here, a lot of fun, some controversy, but that's part of the fun. Maybe some heated discussions even. So let's get started. This is my third major breakdown video on the Snapdragon X Elite. I hope you guys enjoyed my last two. If you haven't yet, please check out those videos. And as always, I do want to encourage you, please support the channel. Subscribing helps. Of course, sharing out the video helps. Commenting right while I'm live is always appreciated. And of course, once the video has been uploaded, I do really want to motivate you. Leave a regular comment afterwards. That helps out tremendously. And of course, if you catch me live, please consider leaving a super chat. In fact, we already have one today from Max Maximus, a long-term supporter of the channel. He rarely gets a chance to watch live, but whenever he does, he watches afterwards and comments. So he's a good boy, saying, sorry, cannot watch live, but we'll check out later. Don't worry, man. Your support is very much appreciated. But we already have Irish Dawn in the chat, Dream SMP, also an absolute OG here. Jan Hendrik, my German supporter. I think now you're one of my 20 German supporters, but you're still like the only active one. And people are already active in the live chat. So as always, thank you so much for all of that. Now, before we get into what you could see basically on the thumbnail, which is the Galaxy Book4 Edge comparison with the M3 MacBook Air, I have found a little bit more data that I would like to talk about with the Snapdragon X Elite, but also when it comes in general to SoCs that compare somewhat directly to Apple's current M3 and M4 lineup. Before I continue, I do want to ask you, as always, please tell me what's the audio quality like, what's the video quality like, if the stream is doing all right. You guys know I'm pretty paranoid about those things, and whenever I have enough people watching who I know are pretty engaged, I do appreciate you being kind of like a tech supporter. So hello, guten Abend to everyone joining here, and let's get started. At first, we do have a little bit of data from Tom's Hardware. This is battery life testing for the latest Snapdragon X Elite laptops. Now, this is somewhat crude testing, unfortunately. We will later also cover a video that does more in-depth breakdown of like I would say like more real life battery life testing, but when it comes to standard battery testing, a lot of people just resort to like, oh, is this like working well in video, right? So they standardize the screen brightness, they test out one specific video at one specific resolution, as much full screen as possible, basically. They won't stretch it out artificially, but if you have like a 16:9 video on a 3:2 aspect ratio screen, and that screen is either mini LED or OLED, that of course is beneficial to that screen because it can run that video while still like 10, 15, 20% of its screen are turned off. Obviously, if you have a comparable size device with a comparable size battery, but that device has only a 16:9 screen, and now that video covers the entire screen, well, and even if you have like a device that doesn't get fully covered by a video, of course you still have to consider, is it mini LED, is it OLED? Because if it's a standard LCD screen, it won't actually benefit from turning parts of its screen off. So yeah, I just wanted to say there's a lot of nuance in properly testing battery life, but we will be going through some somewhat basic numbers here. Jan, you're saying your M2 MacBook Air still has to survive for a few years. Well, so does my M1 Max MacBook Pro, right? I'm waiting until Apple brings tandem OLED to Max. There's no way in hell I will consider anything OLED from here on out on like larger devices that isn't tandem OLED. I've tried it on like the M4 iPad Pro at the Apple Store. It's absolutely phenomenal. The fact that it can actually work, right? My Apple Store in Berlin, or at least the biggest latest one has like the iPads very, very close to huge open doors, and there was so much light shining in that I had like trouble keeping my eyes open, and I was looking at my iPad, and I'm like, at the iPad, not my iPad, and I was like, bro, it's like super readable. Even on the non-nano edged glass, it was absolutely amazing. So yeah, I absolutely understand, Jan. If you're saying you will have to make do with your M2 device, it's still an amazing device, but of course there are other stuff that also improves. Screens improve, speakers improve, network connectivity improves. I just always want to ask people when they're like, oh, these new laptops have Wi-Fi 7 and Apple only has Wi-Fi 6E, and I always ask like, well, how much do you personally really gain from a device having Wi-Fi 6E or Wi-Fi 7, right? Even if at one day you have like Wi-Fi 7 router, what will actually be your network speed be coming from your internet provider, right? And yeah, to me, like I've even side graded like from one Wi-Fi 6 router to another one because I gave away my older one, and it works out flawlessly. I don't need more. I will at some point upgrade to Wi-Fi 7 once I have entirely new devices, but there is absolutely, like, it would not stop me, for example, in considering a device. Yeah, and of course, you don't upgrade a Mac every 1 to 2 years. Like, even going from M2 to M3 wouldn't even make much sense. I would say even going from M2 to M4, unless you're considering, like, maybe upgrading right inside the lineup, like maybe you come from a MacBook Air but you want a MacBook Pro, then it makes sense. But of course, then you also have some different considerations to make, like the MacBook Pros are disproportionately heavier. While they're on mini LED, they might actually have worse battery life in some ways. So there's a smart decision to be had here. And of course, if you guys ever need some helps, I don't know why I pluralize everything like involuntarily in recent videos. But if you ever need help with some kind of purchase or some kind of decision like that, you can catch me live here and discuss it, or you can follow me on Twitter and I might help you out there as well. So Snapdragon X Elite laptops last 15 plus hours on our battery test. So obviously 15 plus hours, this is a somewhat basic task, which in this case is video playback, but Intel systems not far behind. What is interesting that the Intel systems we are talking about here are Meteor Lake systems. So not the latest and greatest Lunar Lake, but Lunar Lake will have to wait for about 3 months or 4 before it actually comes out. At another OG joining the chat, Joseph Guerrero saying, what are my expectations for the M4 Pro? I expect it to be basically a match for the M3 Pro in its like layout. I would say it would have 6 performance cores, 6 efficiency cores. I would believe that it has at least at max 20 GPU cores instead of like 18, which was like a downgrade from 19. So I would hope it's like at least 20. I think it will keep the 192-bit bus, but with 20% faster memory, that would bring it to around 180 gigabyte per second of memory bandwidth, which should be enough for the GPU of that size. Otherwise, I expect it to mostly match the M4 in like single core performance and like the NPU, you know, stuff that basically stays unchanged. I don't know if there will be any kind of like architectural changes. Like if it launches after the A18, there is a chance it might come with a surprise, like a brand new GPU architecture, but I cannot promise you that. And of course, there is a chance that it might update other IP blocks. Don't forget, when the M1 Pro and M1 Max chips came out, like on my MacBook Pro, those had new media encoders and decoders in comparison to the regular M1. They added ProRes, right? So there was definitely some change. And from what I heard from like guys like Hishnesh on Twitter, is that they actually had a slightly changed GPU, not one that necessarily was a lot more faster per GPU core, but that there were some architectural changes there too, beyond just more cores. So yeah, that is about my expectation for M4 Pro. There is the lower end expectation, which is basically just larger M4, but also some maybe more optimistic considerations of maybe it has some other changes too. But let me continue here, right? So they are testing a bunch of laptops right now with the X Elite CPU inside. I would call it an SoC or an APU, because CPU is just like CPU. That would be like the Orion cores, but whatever. That's just my hunch here. When you actually look at those numbers, the only one that is kind of disappointing here is actually the OLED device, which doesn't surprise me because these devices don't actually have like mini LED or whatever. They have like standard LCD. I believe the HP OmniBook X does too, but the HP OmniBook X also has other things, like it is pretty low res in comparison to the other devices here. But you basically get 15 hours here from laptops, and you get 12 hours from a tablet. So nothing game changing, I would say, in comparison to what we now have from MacBooks Air and Pro, but definitely a good step up from what people could usually await on the Windows side. In fact, if you look at the graph of data these guys compiled for other devices, now obviously the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the base M3 leads the pack with its 70 watt hour. It should be said that the MacBook Pro with the M3 Pro comes with a slightly larger battery at like 72 watt hours, but the M3 Pro is a larger chip. Even if you just use it for media playback, it will still consume a tiny bit more power, so that I wouldn't expect it to outperform it. But it's definitely good that Apple has its software so well under control that they can get even like an M3 Max, which is a huge die with like 90 billion transistors or something like that, to perform basically like one of those entry-level SoCs and still give you 17 hours of battery life. And yeah, basically this would just also like scale with the larger screen and everything like that. Yes, there's some inefficiencies that come from it being the M3 Max. Maybe the M3 Pro of the on the 16-inch version could outperform this even still, maybe get closer to like 18 hours or something like that. But yeah, obviously here you get like 99.9 watt hours. Then a surprisingly low result from everything that I have seen is that the 15-inch MacBook Air with its 67 watt hour battery comes in slightly below 15 hours. I've mostly seen it actually hit like these kind of numbers in other tests, but like, right, is it functionally different from these results, right? I mean, this is like an hour more, but this can all be subject to change, basically, I would say. I've also advocated that the MacBook Air models need ProMotion. Not only, of course, does 120 hertz feel a lot smoother, but adaptive refresh, where it would go down to like 48 hertz in like for 24 hertz playback, for 24 FPS video playback, would even further improve efficiency. So I think that would be a good move on Apple side, and a lot of the other laptops here do have like ProMotion like capabilities. Jan Nicholas Ben saying you're considering switching from a 16 gigabyte MacBook Pro to the Yoga Slim 7X with 32 gigabytes for the 16 gig upgrade. Would you say it's worth it? Well, you didn't say you didn't tell me what kind of MacBook Pro you're using. That's a big thing. Like what processor you're using. The Yoga like matters too. Like you're saying it's the Slim 7X, but is that the actual generation, or is that just a class of device? Yoga Slim 7X. Yeah, they're different generations. Like, do you mean like you want the one with the Copilot, basically with the Snapdragon X Elite? Because that entirely, or you're coming from an M2 Pro MacBook Pro, bro. I don't know. No, honestly, not really. Like, I know that some stuff here sounds attractive, but like, I wouldn't. But it depends to you. You're saying like you're a CS student. Well, do you have like significant like shortcomings in terms of supported apps for your study? Like on the MacBook? Because if not, like the problem is this would not be an upgrade in basically any major way. The X Elite has like a boatload of like less GPU power than even the entry level M2 Pro. In fact, it barely beats the base M2. So that would be hard to me if you were like asking me against like a device that like might have like the upcoming Strix point, and you would tell me like, oh, I need these kinds of like Windows apps. I would be like, well, if it's like personal need based. But the X Elite is like the worst kind of device, I would say, to upgrade to in that regard, because the X Elite will not give you that kind of super smooth Windows experience where everything works. You can play games on the side if you want to. All pro apps are like well optimized, be it for Intel or AMD these days. And Joseph Aguilera, who is a CS professional himself, saying, you chose the MacBook because of macOS. The only need for more than 16 gigabyte of RAM is virtual machines and Docker. Well, yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit on what exactly you do, but I think most people can make do with 16 gigabytes. It's just that if you're going, like, if let's say you have a need for 32, I understand that obviously getting a brand new Mac is an expensive thing, right? Maybe some would tell you like, oh, go with like an M3 Pro with, what would it be, like 36 gigabytes, or get at least like the 18 gigabyte version, because that's at least a small upgrade. The issue here is, of course, I understand that's not really price sensitive. You can probably sell your Mac and get like a decent value for it. But my question is like, Jan, will you be selling like your Mac is the question. And Sagar Palai, also new to the stream, I haven't yet read your name here. Should you buy MacBook Air M3 or wait for M4? I would say if you can wait, I would wait. Partially, I would base this on the fact that there was a rumor, or let's say it's like a conspiracy theory, iPad Pro 12 gigs of RAM, which is that the iPad Pro actually uses two, oh my god, today we're doing like a Tom's Hardware stream, I guess, that the two memory modules inside the M4 iPad Pro are not actually two 4 gigabyte modules, but they're actually two 6 gigabyte modules, which obviously would come out to 12 gigabytes of combined RAM. Now, whether Apple uses bin down modules, which isn't very typical for the RAM market, but let's ignore that for a second. Or if Apple just completely artificially locks them down in software so they can upsell you on 16 gigabytes for a higher price. I fully believe that the M4 MacBook Air will start coming with 12 gigs of memory as the base. And I think that if Apple keeps pricing relatively the same, you can either get at that point the M4 MacBook Air at the same price as you can now get the M3 MacBook Air, but with worse specs, or this will push the M3 MacBook Air, let's say the 16 gigs of RAM version price down so significantly that you can then buy an M3 MacBook Air with 16 gigs of RAM for potentially like around $1,000 or something like that. Yeah, and Josephat is giving some tips to Jan Niklas, so thank you for that, because I'm of course not a CS professional myself, but it's just that to me it would really depend on what your specific needs are. Like Jan, you're saying you're using Docker, which I understand is RAM intensive, so you're probably looking at a 32 gigabyte system. I just don't know how advantageous it is to go to Windows on ARM for that, to be honest. And maybe if somebody in your surroundings actually has experience with that, maybe ask them. Sagar saying Windows and AMD and Snapdragon X Elite NPU giving 50 flops compute, and M4 is still 38. So will Apple Mac M4 will have more flop? No, the M4 does 38 flops. The X Elite does 45. The AMD does 50. I do want to say this, and you guys should probably follow me on Twitter for like really detailed understanding of this. Not because of me, but because I also follow very intelligent people there in that regard. Flops or teraflops or by the way, you said flops. It's not flops. Flops is floating point operations. It's teraops. It's trillion operations per second. It's not actually a metric of raw performance where you can compare NPUs of different architecture. In fact, if you look at Geekbench ML results, you will see that like the M3 already vastly outperforms like X Elite. And if you look at, for example, on the mobile side, where the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 supposedly has like a fast NPU, but then if you run actual machine learning workloads, you'll find that the A17 Pro on the iPhone outperforms it by like 3 to 4x often because of how Apple's or what is it called, their compute. It's something ML, their API basically. It's so good. It's written right to the metal. Apple has been improving it a lot to the fact that recently on newer Geekbench results, the A17 Pro performs 25% faster than it used to do. So Sagar, I apologize by the way if I mispronounce your name. If you worry that because of like TOPS numbers, right? One chip is necessarily faster than the others. That's absolutely not true. That is, and of course, you have to consider that most machine learning like benchmarks or like, of course, professional apps also smart enough to utilize your GPU whenever it's prudent. And as I said before, the X Elite doesn't even beat it doesn't even beat fully the M2 in its GPU performance often. So once you combine those things, like your GPU, the ML accelerators on the CPU, things like that, now you basically come to, well, the M4 vastly outperforms the X Elite. And of course, if you think of even like the absolute most bin down version of the upcoming M4, that will just wipe the floor with everything concerning the X Elite at a lower power consumption. So yeah, I wouldn't put too much into the TOPS numbers. And Jan saying you could sell the M2 Pro for 1,400 euros and buy the Slim 7X with 32 gigs of RAM for 1,500. And you like Windows more. Well, in that regard, I actually would tell you to go for it or consider like an Intel or AMD system. This would be then my biggest counterpoint to you, which is why do you look at the X Elite if you could be looking at Strix Point? And in fact, this is our next topic, because Strix Point is based on a combination of 4 Zen 5 and 8 Zen 5C cores. And AMD has promised around a 15% IPC uplift, or 16% to be more precise, over Zen 4. And now we actually have some leaked benchmarks, which are actually Geekbench 6, which is funny because everything is Geekbench these days. It's running on 7500 RAM. It's 32 gigabytes. So hey, that's something you apparently were looking for. This device will just, like, devices with this chip will just destroy the X Elite. And I'm not trying to shit on the X Elite. The X Elite doesn't match in real world games the performance of last gen's 7840U, 8840U, or H, whatever the letters on AMD just keep changing, especially now with their like Ryzen AI 9 365. And we actually got some benchmarks here. This is like comprehensive, basically like a full-on breakdown of all those numbers. Wait, was there like not a Geekbench 6? like result here somewhere along, because I don't want to do this. Like basically it's all like around 15% faster. It outperforms in like something like AVX 512 by a more significant margin, and then it basically combines to like a 15% average. Jan, you're saying you need good battery life, but you can tune a Strix device, like an upcoming Strix Point device, to do give you good battery life. And of course, like I am absolutely honest here, and I've said that time and time again. This is not like an Apple channel in that sense that I will always tell you guys to get Apple devices. I have a personal preference for it. If you really prefer Windows, if you are like forced by work or a study needs to get a Windows laptop, I certainly don't judge you. But of course, when it comes to considerations like Strix Point versus the X Elite, my problem is if I point you towards the X Elite will disappoint you in many performance metrics, my dude. That is the problem. If you were coming from like an M2 MacBook Air, that's one thing. But coming from an M2 MacBook Pro, you will be surprised whenever you are hit with apps that need to run through a translation layer. Now, all of your like expectations for battery life and snappiness will go down the crapper. Obviously, optimized apps will give you a good result. Stuff that is GPU accelerated will not be that impressive, especially not comparison to anything you might be used to on the MacBook Pro. But yeah, I would then tell you, if you can make do with your MacBook Pro for a little bit, wait a month until you get Strix Point results. And maybe even like benchmarks again, because we do have like battery life tests, right? Now those are all Intel tests, but expect like the latest AMD chips to perform pretty similar. I would still probably believe that the X Elite outperforms them in raw battery life, but it also depends on your workload, right? If Strix Points turns out to be substantially faster or at least snappier, and it helps you get your work done faster or more efficiently, how much does more battery life actually come into play if your experience is degraded on the X Elite? And this is why I'm telling you, you should then potentially really ask somebody you know or try hunting on the internet for tests that concern the apps that you actually use. I'm not a CS guy myself. I'm not, obviously, I'm not in, I don't have an X Elite product on myself, so I wouldn't even be able to run benchmarks for you right now. But yeah, that would be kind of my recommendation, to at least wait until next month. Sargar saying, problem with Apple 8 gigs of RAM for Apple Intelligence. It is low in 2024. 8 gigabytes RAM for coders, too little. Copilot PCR starting from... Well, yeah, but that's the point for you, Sagar. The MacBook Air like starts at $1099 with the M3 and 8 gigs of RAM. If you're really looking just for 16 gigabytes, you can get it for $1,300, and that is MSRP. The M3 MacBook Air is basically always discounted by like $100, $150. Yeah, so that's kind of my point. Yeah, and Jan, I understand, of course, that RAM considerations are kind of big for you, so like a Docker user. It's just I'm trying to tell you that if you can make do for at least the coming month, that I would do. If you really need something right now, then I would still invest like at least a week or two in order to find out how well those apps actually perform. Because I right now have no idea, for example, how well even Docker performs on X Elite. I really couldn't tell you. So yeah, that is kind of like my tiny bit excusing of what like not giving you 100% like recommendation, but still giving you some tips on how to work forward. And Sagar, to you, yeah, I understand RAM needs are crucial. This is why I'm I have said Apple should at least give us 12 gigs of RAM on the M4. I had hoped they would do so on the M3. In fact, if they gave the M3 the faster memory and more memory, then I think it would have actually been like a killer upgrade, even for people who are coming from the base M1. But alas, they did not. They did want to optimize their margins, where people were still like buying, at least to a significant degree. I still don't think that 8 gigs of RAM will sell too well in the long-term future. So yeah, I would believe that we are getting M4 with 12 gigs of base memory, and I do believe that 12 gigabytes is good enough for most people. And I would hope part of my push for 12 gigs of RAM is that Apple then makes the upgrade to 24 gigs of RAM significantly cheaper. Well, currently you have to pay $200 to go from 8 gigabytes to 16, from 8 gigabytes to 16 gigabytes, and then another $200 to go from 16 to 24. I hope that Apple just simplifies especially on the MacBook Air, the solutions, and gives you one 12 gigabyte model and one 24 gig model, and differentiates them by like $200 in price. Sagar, I know that 8 gigabytes will affect your SSD. I know people now who have been running like 4 gigs of MacBooks, like 7-year-old devices. Their SSD is still doing fine. The problem with running stuff off the SSD partially, to me, is more performance related, like apps like Lightroom that the MaxTech guys test. They are impacted, obviously, if part of your workflow has to happen on the SSD versus the RAM. But I would never worry about like, oh, does my SSD die because of this? Would 12 gigabytes move to a 192-bit bus or still stay at 128-bit? It would still stay at 128-bit. For one, we do know that the M4 is already 128-bit, but there is no extra memory controller there to make it 192-bit. You just use higher density memory modules, and in fact, you can get, this is part of the reason that apparently you cannot get 4 gig modules anymore on LPDDR5X, or at least some call it LPDDR5X when it's 7500 mega transfers. Some call it just high-end LPDDR5. I don't give a crap what it's called. So apparently you cannot even get 4 gigabyte modules like this one for LPDDR 7500, right? So you can get 6, 8, or I believe even 12 gig modules like that, and then you just scale how many of them you can put into a device. In the case of a 128-bit device, that would be like 2, and yeah, basically things evolve from there. I hope that helps. Yeah, and Josephat, I do know what you're saying. Like, you can pay $200 to go from 48 gigabytes to 64, basically half the price. It's the same discrepancy that you have from Apple, where you have to pay $200 to move from 256 gigabytes to 512 gigabytes of storage, but then you pay the same $200 to go from 512 gigabytes to 1 terabyte. Basically, Apple is optimizing their margins as much as possible to bring devices down from those $1,000 prices to like $1,300-$1,500, because then proportionately to a device that costs like $700-$800 to make, this is where they can make their legendary 40-50% margins instead of 15, 20, 25%. Do you think Windows will take good chunk of Mac market share? No. No, I absolutely do not believe that. I don't think that the X Elite does honestly anything to change the status quo. I think that the Mac plus iPad market, which I usually like to combine, they have their fans. I think Apple needs to do a few things in terms of better value, like I pointed out, to 12 gigs of memory. I do believe that they should also maybe increase the base price by $100, but finally give us 512 gigabytes of storage, or do something crazy like give us 384 gigabytes gigabytes, just so we aren't stuck at 256. And I believe once Apple does those things, everything else will stay absolutely the same with very little impact. The problem with the X Elite, it does not represent an M1 moment. The M1 was a 5 nanometer design at a time when Intel was struggling between like 14 and 10 nanometer. They had to like rename their nodes to like make them look more appetizing. At that point, AMD was still struggling a lot with reaching Intel's levels of single core performance. Nobody had like the kind of tight integration on like an SoC level that was before like the 7840U on AMD side. So Apple could give the GPU a lot more performance than people would traditionally expect from like a small SoC. The Snapdragon X Elite does not do those things because the situation on Windows right now is way better than the Mac situation was in 2020. That's like, at least that's how I see it. Tippermaster, yeah, base 12 gigs plus 512 gigabytes for $99 more would be worth it and become a respectable baseline at least. Yes, that is exactly my suggestion. That's exactly what, and then you also like, that would be like an $1199 MacBook Air. Let's forget even ProMotion or not, which I would obviously like, but then I would believe the base price would go up higher. And at that point, it could eat into the MacBook Pro, which I don't think would is something Apple wants. But yeah, if we get that, then you have to consider then for $200, you get 24 gigabytes, which would make 24 gigabytes now at least $100 cheaper than it used to be. And that is if you like only upgrade the RAM, but keep like 256 gigs of storage on the current configuration. So most likely it would result in a $300 price difference if you want like a high-end MacBook Air. And then once you go to like and maybe Apple could kill like the 1 terabyte storage version and then charge you $400 to go from 512 gigabytes right to 2 terabytes, right? Currently you would have to pay $200 to go from 512 to 1 terabyte and then another $400 to go from 1 terabyte to 2 terabytes. I think Apple could simplify that lineup by giving us 12 gigabytes plus 512 and then let you upgrade to 24 gigabytes of RAM and 2 terabytes of storage respectively, but just make those upgrades like 1/3 cheaper basically. Sagar saying, when can we expect M4 with Mac Mini? The rumors point to end of the year. End of the year could mean like late Q3 to like sometime in Q4. Given how holidays work, it could be put into Q1 of 2025, but I wouldn't believe that. I think they will definitely launch at least in time for the holiday season. My expectation would be kind of around October with like a full-scale launch in November and then like really good availability in December. Yeah, so this is basically the conspiracy theory that I kind of subscribe to of how we get better value. Even if we don't get like 512 gigabytes of storage this year's space, I do believe we'll get at least more RAM. Jan, if like the yoga is really appealing to you, I don't even know which X Elite you would be getting on it. But I would encourage you to wait at least until we have more data in Strix Point. And speaking of that, Strix Point, I cannot type today apparently. Geekbench 6. Yes, MacBook Air will be supposedly next year, but it's weird because some say that we are getting like MacBook Pro and Mac Mini right now. Well, this year, but then like MacBook Air later. So it's hard to tell. I'll open this German site, I think, for a second. Because yeah, I don't know why, but I thought that Tom's Hardware was like giving us a nice breakdown, but this is Geekbench 5, this is spec. So you can see that basically if you compare what matters here, which I would say is Strix Zen 5 versus Zen 4, the 7840U, I don't think that it's actually like much of a competitor for the 7735U, but you can see that here you get like 10%, basically going from the 35U to the 840U, or like 11.5%, and then you basically get like almost a perfect 10% here for the same 4.8 gigahertz. So that's basically a raw IPC improvement of around 10%. Yeah, 9.71%, and then Zen 5C is also like scaling in a pretty similar fashion. It's just that, of course, it's designed to be like lower IPC in general, which that's a little tricky sometimes. Sometimes AMD will tell us, no, Zen 5C has the exact same IPC. Not really. It does have way too little cache for that. It clocks definitely a lot lower, so you can treat it really like an efficiency core, even though it does technically have mostly the same architectural capabilities of Zen 5. It is definitely not Zen 5. Joseph saying, do you think Apple's focus in the gaming world will be what pushes Apple to move the baseline? Yes, I always believe that gaming will push devices in like value ways. I think this is why consoles are like notorious for their high value amount of storage and memory and a large SoC. Like if you think like how large the PS5 SoC is, given the price of the PS5 and the fact that it has to be cool, that the power supply has to be powerful enough, that you have to have 16 gigs of RAM for it, that you have to have a 1 terabyte of fast NVMe storage on there. Yeah, I do believe that gaming will push value forward on the Mac side. Who will be the winner in processors? Snapdragon, Intel, AMD, and Apple. Everyone launching new architecture. I think that you're saying AMD will lead among gamer. I 100% disagree for two reasons here. Well, for one reason, I would agree with you because for now, it seems like Strix Point will have a very large GPU. It also has enough cores to really run games, which like Lunar Lake with 4+4 cores really isn't that well tuned for it. Don't forget, people always make the mistake. They compare something like the 7840U, right, which is 8 cores of Zen 4 at 4.8 gigahertz, often running at in like 28 watt to like 54 watt devices, and Strix Zen 5 will follow it in the exact same way. And then they compare it to the base M series processor, a processor this is designed for like 12 to 18 watts, has peaks of like around 22 watts. And then the actual competitor for this chip are Apple's Pro chips, not the base M series chip in any way. And the Pro chips decimate the 840 class that we have seen with the 7840, the 8840, or what would now be like Ryzen AI 9 365. God, I hate the naming. But yeah, I do not believe that you can compare these chips to the base M. The only reason people do so is because people is notorious for asking high prices, and this is how like an M3 MacBook Air might launch in the price category of a 7840U or like a Ryzen 7 or Ryzen 9 AI device. But if you compare those chips purely on power versus performance output, and in that point you have to not compare this to the base M but the M Pro, and this is where the M Pro absolutely wins. It's more efficient, it has higher GPU peak performance, it is more versatile with its like even with like 6+6 design versus its 4. This one will be like 4+8, or this one is just 8 cores. And when you even look at the IPC uplifts, the Zen 5 has a smaller IPC uplift over Zen 4 than M4 does over something like even the M3, but definitely like M2. The reason why I compared to M2 is because of a 2-year difference. That's about the difference that we have from Zen 4 to Zen 5. But when it comes to gaming, of course, Sagar, I actually agree with you in the sense that like the actual gaming situation on Strix point, at least for a while, will be significantly better than that of Mac, simply out of developer support. Guys, we have been streaming for a little bit. I do want to remind you again, I don't want to be too much of a subscribe and comment and all that jazz, but I do want to remind you to do all the YouTube jazz, as I call it: subscribing, liking, sharing, commenting, and of course, if you want to support this channel directly while I'm live, you can leave a super chat. Again, big shout out again to Max Maximus, who left us a super chat even before we went live, and or you can leave a super sticker, or you can subscribe to my Patreon, which obviously helps you fund this channel in the long term. I reinvest everything that comes to me directly from the channel back into the channel. This is a hobby, but one that I take seriously, so thank you all so much for all your support. Sagar, you're saying done. I assume you mean you left a like, because the like button went up just as you said that. So we do have the spec numbers here, and then when you look at Geekbench, now this is Geekbench 5. I don't know where like Geekbench 6 was, because I've seen Geekbench 6 results that come in at around 3,000 points in single core. So I'll briefly look that up again. AMD Strix point, this is WCCF Tech. This is the same thing. This is spec again. Oh, this is Geekbench 6, right? Oh, this is the one I actually wanted. This is really, really good. So we do have total results for Geekbench here, which on the 7735 view, which I assume this one doesn't clock really up to its highest frequency. I'm not an expert on this chip. Everything that I know more about like AMD's SoCs has more to do with like the 7840U. Let me just briefly like look up the 7735U. What is its like architectural makeup? General specification. It's a Zen 3 Plus core. Yeah, that makes sense. It has significantly lower IPC than Zen 4. Tipomaster saying, you're kind of curious if Apple will get back to performance leadership in SSDs. When adopted NVMe early, they had it, but waffled it. They cap it at 3 gigabits per second for a while. The pros are faster. The pros reach up to 7 gigabits, which is like the fastest you can go with PCIe 4 on a 4-lane setup. I would believe that once Apple goes to Zen 5, to PCIe 5 connectivity on their higher end chips, I do believe that they will probably give us like 10 gigabytes per second, maybe 12, 14, maybe all the way to the max 14, baby. And then they will upgrade the MacBook Air. I do believe, by the way, the thing that they will then do to the MacBook Air is that they will start it with 3 gigabyte per second SSDs that then go up to like 6 or 7 by having twice as many memory modules. So what instead they will do, I believe they will pull the trick that they did that people didn't like. And I think they might actually get super creative about that, because they can then stack, use like an uneven amount of memory modules the way that the M3 Pro or even the M3 Max can not populate every single of its RAM slots, right? Because you can have like 300 gigabytes per second on the M3 Max, but you can also have 400 gigabytes per second for its memory. And I think they will actually do something similar, where if you get like let's say you get 1 terabyte of storage, right? And maybe the upgrade, the next up, and maybe that will be what would be a better example? Let's say we start instead of starting with 512 gigabytes on the MacBook Pro going forward, right, with the M Pro, we start with 768 gigabytes, right? And it's consistent maybe where there previously were 2 modules, now it's 3, right? And now we go from 7 gigabytes per second to 10 gigabytes per second. And then once you upgrade to 1 terabyte for maybe $100 or something, now you get the full speed. Or maybe what I think could happen is you can only upgrade from 768 gigabytes right to 2 terabytes. And you start with 3 256 gigabyte modules that give you like around 10 gigabyte per second. But when you go to 2 terabytes, now you get 4 512 gigabyte modules, and those combined give you 14 gigabytes per second, right? I think once Apple reaches those far higher speeds, I think they will feel comfortable with playing around with like the amount of storage modules, the amount of memory modules. We have seen that already, so I'm not making this up completely. Like, we have had Apple give you fewer memory modules in the MacBook Air. We have had Apple go down from a 256-bit bus configuration to 192-bit bus configuration. We have seen Apple offering only 400 gigabytes per second on the M1 Max and the M2 Max to offering 2 versions, one with 300 gigabytes per second on the M3 Max and one with 400 gigabytes per second on the M3 Max. So I fully believe that Apple could play around with storage in a similar fashion because, well, partially they already did, and partially because I think that will enable them to really charge very creatively while still improving value. They could like say, oh, our base config for the M4 Pro MacBook Pro, right, at $2,000 is now 768 gigabytes rather than 512, but there is no 1 terabyte version. Instead, you have to pay 400 gigabytes to go from 768 to 2 terabytes, which makes 2 terabytes a little cheaper than it used to be, but now more people have to get 2 terabytes in order to get 1 terabyte or more, which I know for a lot of people 1 terabyte is enough, but they would like maybe just a little bit more than 768. And I believe that Apple could play around with that. I know that was a very, very long response. I apologize. But yeah, so the results we have here. So this is Zen 3 Plus, which is interesting. I didn't even know that Zen 3 Plus clocks it up to 4.8 gigahertz on mobile. This is 7840U at 5.1 gigahertz. So this is not at the same frequency. It's this is a pre-production Zen 5. So maybe it will still clock higher in the real world. But if you actually compare these two, this goes from 2650 as its max result on Geekbench 6 for single core at up to, like, let's say a full 3000, which obviously the M3 already gives you around 3100, maybe like 3150, and then the M4 gives you like 3700 and higher, depending a little bit on cooling. I believe that Max will probably reach 3800 more easily because, well, I believe the max clock speed will be about the same as on the iPad Pro. I do still believe that in general, the stability for the max frequency will be better. So yeah, I just, and this goes back to also the long discussion that we had here with Jan, who asked like, well, you want long battery. Well, this is higher than the highest results for the Snapdragon X Elite. So even if you wanted to, you could downclock this by like maybe 5% in firmware, right? Not let it run it, or even better, just turn it on into a balanced mode or something like that. And then you get still the advantages of native x86 support, the fact that AMD is a long-established company that actually builds like continuous generations of processors, which means that developer support will be better, firmware support will most likely be better, driver support will most likely be better, and a much, much more powerful GPU versus what is in the X Elite. Like the the even Zen 5 by its like Strix point by itself has like 40% faster GPU than the 7840U, and the 7840U is already faster than the X Elite. So obviously the uplift here would be monumental. And then you have like the question of native app versus translated app. I do believe this will be like absolutely incomparable. Yeah, so just saying here. Yeah, so basically 15% IPC uplift. We don't know about the power consumption in detail. We know that these two devices were targeting like a similar like watt class device, right? But we don't actually know like how much wattage was actually used at any given moment. And then multi-core results do actually come out somewhat similar to the X Elite, and in fact to the M4, the base M4, not the upcoming like M4 Pro or anything like that, but like between 14,000 and 15,000. However, I do have to say I've seen like 7840 perform a lot better. Now this is 28 watts versus 54 watts. That basically doesn't matter when you compare single core results. As I said, we don't know, we haven't got numbers how much what the peak like power consumption is for single core, but when it comes to multi-core, this one was using like almost double the performance. But again, we don't know if that applies to the actual class of the chip, or if there was actually also a meaningful like real life difference in max power consumption. And I would also be very curious to see, well, if your GPU uses 40, like gives you 40% more performance, or let's even say like just 30, does that come with a noticeable increase in power consumption or not? And what happens if you like lock the GPU to a certain max power consumption, like what is happening on the Windows handhelds, right? Do you lock it to maybe like 22 watts or something like that? What is then the actual like performance per watt increase over last generation? That is a little bit of the unfortunate story of Strix Point, the fact that it's built like on basically the same node as the 8840U, the 7840U. So I don't know how much more efficient it will be. It definitely should be at least a little bit more efficient, but I don't know if that's enough to offset like 40% higher GPU performance. Yeah, and then we do have again the single core results. We do see stuff like that the floating point like outperforms basically other benchmarks and things like that. But yeah, I would wait for the final results, but I did think that these results would still be interesting to you guys. So IPC uplift here would be 10% versus Zen 4 in spec. This is this relative performance, 15% uplift in Geekbench, and yeah, so numbers about where AMD promised, but not game changing, likely not enough to fully catch up to M3 in many ways. And then of course the M4 already exists. It's just the only question is how long until we get M4 MacBook Pro, MacBook Air, things like that. So it's now been almost an hour, and basically the short introductory topic that I wanted to talk about, which is like battery life, I kind of almost ignored. But basically what I'm trying to say is that the X Elite right now definitely seems to be the best Windows chip for efficient like movie playback and things like that. But Intel is not so far behind with its Meteor Lake designs that you can only consider the X Elite. That would be kind of my response. Now, of course, you do have to consider that, of course, with an Intel device, you might have to buy a device with a larger battery in general to get close. But you do also get those larger batteries. Yeah? Like OEMs definitely are putting pretty large batteries into their Intel products. They're putting a relatively generous generous amount of cooling inside. And then, of course, often those chips are also the ones that get like dedicated GPUs. You don't get the choice right now to get a Snapdragon X Elite with like a dedicated NVIDIA GPU. If you buy like an Intel system, you're much more free in your choice. And as I said, Lunar Lake is around the corner, and Strix Point. But even more importantly, I would say that Arrow Lake, with like its Intel 20A designs and things like that, could actually be the more meaningful step forward, because Lunar Lake will be a very small SoC. It has 4 performance, 4 efficiency cores. It will likely not beat like the X Elite in multi-threaded performance, even if it's like on a newer node, or it can have higher IPC or whatever. But with Strix Point, you do have 12 cores. There might be 8 Zen 5C and 4 Zen 5 cores, so that won't give it enough power to fully beat the X Elite in multi-threaded, but it will beat it in like single core performance, graphics performance, most likely NPU performance. Now, we do have to consider things like that Copilot Plus, unfortunately, right now only exists on X Elite, but everything that I've seen from Copilot Plus right now points to it not being really worth it that much. So, and with that, the first hour of the stream is over. I do want to call you out, guys, again. Please do all the YouTube jazz as I quickly transition to the Max Tag video here. I do have another video compared. Obviously, I won't go entirely through it, and we might take some time. Maybe we'll go through more data in an upcoming video, but there are some good gaming benchmarks here that I think are worth considering.
Can the most powerful
However,
Snapdragon...
right now I do want to really analyze like how does the first batch of X Elite devices actually compare with what Apple has put out? And right now, when it comes to price comparison, you do have to compare it sort of with the MacBook Air. But yeah, if we are talking actual like wattage and experience, then you would more realistically compare it to the M3 Pro. So I do want to ask you guys, please let me know if my audio is well balanced against Vadim, because I'm always worried that I am too loud, or that the guys are too loud, or I am too quiet, or they are too quiet in comparison. So yeah, please do that.
X Elite laptop beat out Apple's M3 MacBook Air? Well, in this video, we have the Galaxy Book4 Edge with the absolute fastest X Elite, the 84 SKU. So
that's, by the way, not the fastest. That one is the one that clocks it up to 4.2 gigahertz. There is a version that clocks it up to 4.3, but I cannot find any device running that version of the X Elite. So yeah, right now it is the fastest. And by the way, if you think that I made a typo in my title, but when I call it the Galaxy Book4 Edge, and there is like no gap between like book and 4, no, that's the official name. I know people write it usually as Galaxy Book like gap 4, but no, I actually went to Samsung's website and checked their official marketing material. You actually have to write it Galaxy Book 4 like and Edge. It's such a stupid name.
We'll be testing everything, including design, ports, displays, keyboards, trackpads, SSDs,
I think
performance,
it's slightly
and yes,
sped
battery
up.
life, because both of these are at 100%. We're gonna unplug them right now, and we are gonna see which one holds up better. Now, even though you can tell that the chassis on the 16-inch Book4 Edge is larger than the 15-inch MacBook Air, the MacBook actually has a battery that's 19% bigger in terms of the watt hours. And right here, you can see all of the specs above, and the big takeaway is that the MacBook Air is actually $150 more expensive if you spec it.
That's the 10-core GPU version. Oh, they did spec it out to 1 terabyte SSD. So here you would end up with, well, basically what you get here is like a larger, potentially better screen. Well, it's not potentially. I guess I can just call it better. this is the base M3, so it will lose in multi-threaded, but it will definitely win in single-threaded workloads. A 10-core GPU, that's the fully enabled one. That one absolutely decimates the even the 4.6 teraflop version. 16 gigs of RAM, I believe, should behave better on the M3 than they will on the Galaxy Book4 Edge, because macOS is in general more efficient. I do want to tell you guys, it's not twice as efficient, and especially if you're using stuff like virtual machines, if we go back to the discussion we had, that's one thing. But yeah, in general, if you're doing stuff like browsing, especially like Safari, I believe Apple said that Safari uses like 25% less RAM than Chrome or something like that, and gives you like 2 to 3 hours longer battery life on a Mac. And that's with the fully like optimized ARM version of Chrome. So yeah, that's just the way it is. There are just some efficiencies on Apple's like closed off ecosystem that can be had that just cannot be fully replicated on Windows. This is why like people really were hopeful historically for Microsoft Surface devices, until they kind of understood, oh, Microsoft isn't building their own processors. Microsoft really isn't giving them as much attention as they should and stuff like that.
The same with 1 terabyte SSD and 16 gigs of RAM. Now for the battery test, I do have it in best performance mode, because if you don't have it there, it cuts down the performance like crazy. It's gonna be a lot slower.
Wait, what is the
MacBook
battery capacity? Like, is it 50 watt hours? If the 15-inch MacBook Air has a 67 watt hour battery, Galaxy Book4 Edge. You see, now I'm writing it the way it should be written, but whatever. Galaxy Book4 Edge, battery size. Is there like an official spec point here? Samsung, there. Can I just go to... Jesus Christ. Dynamic OLED, their specs. Oh my God. What the? I clicked on specs. View more. Oh my God. Like, you click on specs and it gives you... Wait, it's eUFS storage? eUFS storage is dirt slow. What? Oh, wait, what? Am I mixing this up, guys? eUFS... Oh, that's the mobile standard, but it's not NVMe, but it's it should be like the latest one, right? In there, that's a little weird though. That they optimized it for like efficiency and to get storage as cheap as they could. Sapphire Blue, Bluetooth 5.3, so not 5.4 for some reason, like all the other. One HDMI 2.1 port, supports 4K 60. Then it's not HDMI 2.1, then it's HDMI 2, and then the only thing that it has out of 2.1 are like maybe newer eARC specs. That's weird. Like, why wouldn't it be 4K 120? Like, the whole reason of HDMI 2.1 was like 8K 60 and 4K 120, and it has a 55.9 watt hour battery. Okay, so like basically 11 watt hours more, which is 1/5, around 20%. That makes sense. Okay, so that explains how light it is at 2.5 pounds. I already heard that it doesn't have like the best speakers, or like it's not as sturdily built, but like, yeah, it's at 55 watt hours. It definitely doesn't compete with the 15-inch MacBook Air. Damn, that's a shame. That's a lot of like potential left on the table, basically.
You have to have it in best performance, and I do want to mention that this is a 120 hertz display, so we are going to have it in that mode because if you're buying it, you want to make the most out of it, which is a big advantage compared to the MacBook Air. Most people...
I think you should always leave it in like variable refresh rate if it has like that option. So even what like the iPhones do, right, where they will vary like your refresh rate depending on like your scrolling speed or something like that. But if your device supports at least over 60 hertz, I think you should do it. I guess the Surface Pro 7 isn't eUFS because it's faster than the MacBook Pro drives, and small block random's arguably more important than peak sequential. Yeah, I'm surprised to read that it's EUFS. It's not like it's not garbage. But I shouldn't have called it that. I mixed that up with something else. But it's definitely not like NVMe level. At which point, once you approach $2,000 and you get closer to the MacBook Pro, and considering that you can often get it like the $2,000 MacBook Pro for around $1,800, now you do get less storage at 512 gigabytes versus 1 terabyte, but you do get 18 gigabytes of RAM versus 16. You get much better at that point, like single core performance with active cooling, so it's actually sustained performance. You get about the same multi-threaded results as the X Elite, but actually at lower power consumption. And you get the mini LED screen, which I know that people are like pushing really OLED is like superior. I have always said OLED does have 2 points to me where it's objectively superior. That's response times and of course a lot faster. And it's pixel by pixel brightness control in terms of like perfect blacks. Now mini LED can give you perfect blacks, but they're not pixel by pixel level, so I give you that. But mini LED on the iPhone, on the MacBook, gives you 600 nits and gives you actual 600 nits. Like you can replicate 600 nits always on that device now, versus a lot of OLEDs that are rated for 500 nits are more like 400, and 400 has always been a little bit iffy to me. It's like borderline. It's like around 450 is where I believe like peak brightness becomes more useful in like brighter scenarios. And it's not like I live in the Sahara, I live in Germany, but even here, whenever I use my devices outside or close to a window, I do like me 500 nits on my MacBook Pro, but I have also like Vivid installed, which puts it at up to 1,000 nits, which is also like the peak brightness you get on the M4 iPad Pro. But with the other thing that I wanted to mention with mini LED, not only can it get a lot brighter than like this kind of OLED, right? Tandem OLED obviously keeps up with mini LED, but you also don't have to worry about burn-in. And in my opinion, I generally do like the color reproduction of mini LED better than I do OLED. I know that's a weird thing to say. I know most people won't agree, but to me, even comparing like my iPhone, which is like perfectly calibrated in anything, versus my mini LED M1 iPad Pro and my mini LED M1 Max MacBook Pro, I have always liked the colors on like LCD more. It's just that I hated that LCD couldn't give you perfect blacks, which mini LED can do. And Apple is generous with the amount of backlight zones that you can have. So, but I definitely prefer it like over my LG C. I don't know if I have the C1 or the C2, I think it's the C2 OLED TV. Like even in the most accurate mode, I would always take like mini LED versus OLED. It's just that OLED also has those benefits like the pixel response times, which really matter to me. Whenever I play a 120 hertz game, I like to show off to myself that like, oh my God, it's 0.1 millisecond response time. It doesn't actually matter that much, but my OCD brain feels like it matters.
It's gonna leave it default. And I do want to mention that this has adaptive refresh rate that goes down to 48 hertz.
No, nice. That's what I said. You should always keep that on. I see no problems with that, even if that means sometimes maybe a 120 hertz panel will go down to 90 hertz. I know that's not how adaptive refresh rate really works on Windows, but I have no problems with that. To me, everything over 80 hertz feels super smooth. It's 50 to 70 where I'm like, oh, I can live with that, but I wouldn't really want to pay premium price for that. And then obviously anything below that, it's where it turns into garbage.
A benefit over the 60 hertz MacBook Air. This is also a 400 nit display compared to 500, so that's an additional benefit in terms of battery life. Speaking of the displays, the one on the Samsung,
I forget, it's the M2 iPad Air, the 13-inch, it actually gives you like 600 nits of SDR brightness. The M3 MacBook Airs don't have that.
It's mind-blowingly good. It's their Super AMOLED, and as you can tell, everything just pops so much more. It actually looks brighter, even though the nit rating is lower than the MacBook.
Yeah,
so that's
but
kind of interesting for HDR at least. But the color
yeah, but isn't it like rated for HDR 600 brightness? So isn't it its HDR brightness at least a little higher?
colors are popping. It looks amazing. In terms of reflection, I almost feel like the Samsung is less reflective than Apple's MacBook Air, which is crazy because Apple's usually the best. But it's on a whole nother level when you dim the lights down. You can see the massive difference in the colors just popping, the brightness, everything looks amazing.
I'm watching this on mini LED.
The blacks are perfectly
there
black
I see the
compared
difference,
to the LCD
but
panel on
I
the
don't
MacBook
think
Air,
that the
which looks
first thing they
super
filmed really
gray,
showed the difference all
terrible
that
when the
well.
lights are off.
Yeah, but
so
this,
in terms of the display, Samsung wins out by far, especially with the 120 hertz and everything else. Now, in terms of the design, they both have a really nice aluminum metal chassis. You can see, once again, the footprint is quite a bit bigger on the Book 4 Edge. In terms of the thickness, the MacBook Air is definitely thinner here where the wedge is at, but on the other side, they're basically the same thickness. Now, in terms of the ports, the MacBook has the MagSafe 3 connector, which I love because it's magnetic, really convenient. Now, it also has two...
By the way, guys, I did the meme recently. You know how MagSafe on Macs was like sold as like, well, you can trip over your cable and not actually like trip up your device and make it like fall to the floor. I actually did that, like really full force ran against the cable while walking out from the corner where I usually sit while filming my videos, and it flew away at such a freaking speed, like a freaking snake attacking something. Yeah, and I was like, oh, this is the first time where like I really felt super grateful for MagSafe, because at that point my iPhone was still like connected as like continuity camera with that little Belkin adapter on top, because I use my iPhone as the camera for this channel. So that would have meant that my MacBook and my iPad flew probably against my iPad and all went to the floor and maybe crashed partially against my microphone on the way. It's like several thousand of dollars that could have gone wrong. So yeah, I'm now a big fan of MagSafe.
USB-C ports, which are called USB 4, but they technically support the Thunderbolt features like daisy chaining. On the other hand, the Samsung just has two USB 4 ports, no daisy chaining on those, has HDMI right here. On the other side, they both have the headphone jack, and the Samsung comes with the micro SD card slot.
Micro SD card slots. As I've said, I've seen like benchmarks that show like just how terrible this one is, like where it tops out at like 40 megabits per second or something like that, where you will get like 300 on like the full size SD card slot on the MacBook Pro. Again, we've also talked about like the HDMI port being HDMI 2.1, but not being 4K 120. And of course, like, Apple's headphone jacks are pretty good. I don't really care about that. I won't artificially pretend that I do. Even I use my USB-C earpods, but USB-A, man, I hate the fact that USB-A is still there. It just keeps holding the industry back. I've seen like that a lot of mice still come out with a Type-C to A cable, right? So they plug into your device via USB-A, but then of course the mouse itself is USB-C. And I'm like, bro, just give us like a base like 5 gigabits per second USB 3 Type-C port here. Let us also charge maybe then from this side. Even maybe it's like, maybe you can only charge at full speed from one side, but maybe this one gives you like 30 watts versus 60 on the other side or something like that. I would take that in a heartbeat versus an extra USB-A port. I have no sympathy left for USB-A. I just think at this point it's absolutely holding all of us back. It is getting like no support, right? Because like it's not like we are getting USB 4.2, 4.1 USB-A ports or something like that. All improvements are going to USB Type-C, which means that every time you get a USB Type-A port, it's by definition outdated. Like with SD cards, we can argue, well, does it support the absolute latest SDXC standard or something like that? But then your question is like, well, do you even have an SD card like that? And even with a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack, you're like, well, how powerful does it actually need to be before you would probably want to use an external DAC? through USB-C anyway. And then like, what is the point with USB-A? Is it just to connect like old stuff? Because like we should move on at some point. We did that with Lightning to USB-C now even, right? It's not like Apple kept Lightning around as an alternative port. It's I just don't like it. I'm sorry. I know might not be like a super pro-consumer take, but I have no sympathy left for USB-A.
And a USB-A. So the Samsung wins in terms of the ports, and I do really like this thin design that they did on the side. And as for the weight, the Samsung is a little bit heavier, 3.42 pounds.
In my opinion, it actually doesn't, because like USB 4 versus Thunderbolt is definitely a difference. And yeah, you get HDMI, but I always tell people, like, how often do you actually need those extra ports? I've had now my MacBook Pro for over 2 years. It launched it late 2021. Yeah, just all of 2022, all of 20. Yeah, it's 2.5 years. And I used my HDMI port like once, and I have no idea. Like, I know that sometimes it's like, oh, but whenever you need it, it's good to have it. I'm like, yeah, but I would prefer extra Thunderbolt ports, to be honest, on my MacBook. Guys, we have over 20 people watching. Please leave a like. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my content. Share it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. Leave a comment. Let me know what you agree with, what you disagree with. Maybe you think my rant on USB-A is downright deranged and that people should keep supporting this ancient standard. Maybe you are a big fan of ultra slow micro SD card slots because it's better than nothing, even though you could have had a full-size SD card slot. But Samsung really wanted to save like 50 cents. So yeah, let me know. I think that just the inclusion of MagSafe makes this better, to be honest. Joseph, it took me 2 years to realize my MacBook Pro HDMI was broken, lol. Yeah, I would feel, if you told me tomorrow my HDMI was broken on my MacBook Pro, I would 100% believe you and also still not care. I would be like, oh, let me test it out or whatever, and then completely ignore it, even if it's actually broken.
Compared to 3.3. And now, of course, we got to do our classic speaker test. So let's see which one is better.
Oh, I apologize, guys. Maybe I should have muted myself before I laughed this way. People in my surroundings call this my devil laugh, that's when you get the full like deepness of my voice whenever I laugh. These speakers are a freaking joke. They're downright firing, right? I looked at the sides. I thought those were like intakes for the fans, but they seem like they are the part of that, and they're also speaker grills, or they're just speaker grills, or maybe the speakers are somewhat up here. Now on the the MacBook Air, unfortunately, they took away from us like front speakers like around here and here, which is where they are still on the MacBook Pro, but they do have them like here. But Apple still manages to give you a lot of surround experience. For the best one, you do have to go for the MacBook Pro models, but man, this difference though. Ooh. And the reason, by the way, this to me is almost as important as the difference between like the displays, right? And some people will like say, well, how can it be? Like crappy speakers are less bad than a crappy screen. And in general, I would agree. By the way, like look at the blacks on the screen here. Why does the MacBook look noticeably more black? Maybe that's just the way the camera is, because maybe there's like a slight blooming here going on the camera side, not on the screen. But because when you look here, right, this is where the hinge sits. This is where you get like a little bit of black plastic, and here you get more of that on the Samsung. And when you combine the black on the screen here, you can actually see that it's pretty much in line with the black here, well, here this looks gray. Now, this might be the specific scene in the video, but I have seen some stuff that says that this OLED doesn't feel as perfectly black in like bright scenarios, where it reflects light in a weird way, where it gets almost a little grayish, where it's really, really good for like dark stuff, like when you're using it in the dark. But once you go under bright light, you use a lot of the contrast from OLED. Again, I cannot speak to that. I don't want to shit on this device before. Well, I obviously won't test it realistically anytime soon. It's just that I have seen this now in several videos where the OLED screen does not quite perform the way I expected to. Also, great keyboard keys are not as easy to read. Yeah, in the dark, definitely not. Which is definitely still better than the VivoBook silver ones, which apparently also have a crappy backlight, which is like the worst combination I've ever heard of. But yeah, the problem is also here it's like gray on gray, right? Sometimes you want like nice gray keys, maybe like gray against a black overall keyboard. I hate the stickers, but whatever, you that's what you get here. And you have the Copilot button now, which, yeah, thank you, Microsoft. Does this actually mean like yeah, we have a Windows button now and the Copilot button on the other side. Like, Microsoft, come on, that's way too much better. I do believe, by the way, part of the reason what keeps those prices down here a little is the aggressive integration also with Microsoft, where like I think that Microsoft is right now really like helping subsidize the X Elite, so they can push Copilot stuff, because currently it is exclusive to the X Elite, and this is how we get like with stupid shit like a lot of people say like, oh, Apple loves to brand itself, right? Tell me where on this keyboard, right? Like where is the Apple branding? Like function key, command keys, several command keys, controls, option, all your standard stuff, right? While it's here, it's like Energy Star. By the way, Energy Star hasn't updated their standards significantly enough for Apple to care about them for like close to a decade almost. When they had like Intel chips inside, they would always bring up like, oh, we are Energy Star certified because we consume only so and so little like in standby and whatever. Right now, Apple is so far ahead of the Energy Star like requirements, they don't even bother doing any of that. Then this is like Dolby Atmos or something, dynamic. Oh no, this is for the screen. Okay, and then the Snapdragon X Elite sticker, and then you have like Windows and Copilot. My God, like. And some complained about the iMac chin with the Apple logo in the past. Yeah, the speakers are like two classes higher.
I don't know what you guys heard, but to me, the MacBook Air destroyed the Samsung. Yeah. This thing is all highs. It just feels so dull. There's no bass, so the voice even sounds just kind of empty, whereas the MacBook Air now has a 6-speaker system with 2 new subs added to it, so it's so full and rich, just destroys it. Now let's do a quick webcam and microphone test.
That doesn't look bad. I'll actually give a compliment here. It looks a little softish, but I always say I do prefer a slightly softer look versus an over sharpened one. It seems like it has mild problems keeping him in focus. Almost seems like the wall is a little more in focus, or like the back of his shoulder, but that's easy to offset by like turning back of a little bit or something. It's not like the MacBook's camera is fantastic. There's a reason why I use my iPhone as the camera for this channel, but this generally looks good.
Or Edge. And then here we have the webcam and the microphone on the 15-inch.
Yeah, I have to say, I'll give that. I think that the Galaxy Book actually wins that webcam. The MacBook has better microphones though.
Air, let me know which one's better down below. And the last thing I want to do before I jump into the performance is compare the keyboards and the trackpads. Now, to me, I really like these new Magic keys on the MacBooks. They're very clicky. Compared to the Samsung, these kind of feel a little bit mushy.
Yeah, Samsung has like I cannot speak to this device, but the last time I went to a tech store, I tried like basically the predecessor to this device. I have maintained for years that the best like mobile keys together with Apple's, but probably by like 5% better, are the keys on the Surface laptops. Not on the Surface like the attachment shit or whatever, but the actual sturdy Surface laptop with an aluminum body, sometimes the Alcantara cover on top. Like those keys feel amazing. And I think they're basically indistinguishable to the MacBooks in terms of quality. I do believe they feel a little different, but the Magic keys or like they do feel great on the MacBook. But the Surface just gives you a tiny bit more travel, things like that. It's very, very feedbacky. The Galaxy Book, the last time I checked it, was incredibly mushy. Actually, like I don't know if they improved it. Like what he's saying is exactly my user experience or my tester experience with those things where yeah, I would never. And also like just to me generally, like the pad on the side is like nice or whatever, but there needs to be a gap. I cannot stand when they're like when the numpad is like right there, like you have like your last keys here from your regular keyboard and then you immediately transition to the numpad. I hate that. I really cannot stand that.
Me, but of course it's up to what you prefer.
Guys, we've been streaming for now 1.5 hours. I do want to give out a call out to action now again. Please, if you're enjoying this, leave a like. That helps out tremendously. It helps us always find new people, as does subscribing, of course. Share the video to anybody who you think might like it. Comment while I'm live to let me know what you agree with, what you disagree with, what you think of this entire discussion. And of course, if you want to support this channel directly, again, shout out goes out to Max Maximus, who supported us even before the stream started. Leave a super chat, leave a super sticker. Any small donation, even $1, is very much appreciated. And of course, if you feel like supporting this channel directly in the long term, subscribe to my Patreon. Link is in the description of this channel.
But the trackpads, the one on the MacBook is definitely the winner. It's a Force Touch trackpad, so it doesn't actually move at all. It just has a magnet that vibrates behind it, whereas the Samsung has that traditional diving board design.
Yeah, and look, those are small things that people don't think about, but there's a reason why MacBooks are notorious for like living a long life. Like I know that these devices don't have hard drives inside, right? For example. So I understand that moving parts are not really that common, which means that obviously even if you shake it around, you don't break anything. But
honestly,
like you saw the keyboard flex, right? Or the trackpad flex, how much the device was actually giving away under his clicking. And I don't mean the trackpad, I mean the actual chassis. This is the kind of durability that a lot of people don't understand. That's the kind of durability that legitimately buys you higher longevity. On a mobile device that moves around a lot, that in your backpack like crashes with other stuff and things like that. Some stuff might get dislocated ever so slightly, a connector or anything over time. Again, I'm not saying this will happen even in your first year or two of usage, but if you like are like many MacBook users, have your like your laptop or whatever for like 7, 8, or 10 years because you handed it down to somebody in your family, maybe your kids at some point, right? Maybe you just keep it as a secondary device. This is when you get to appreciate the durability of like a proper aluminum unibody chassis. Like, unfortunately, I cannot do a British accent, or I would do like the Johnny Ive aluminum thing, right? For that, please go to iCave Dave's channel. But yeah, those are small things that add to cost, research and development, and build cost on MacBooks, and those kind of things you don't actually find on the spec sheet.
Can't stand it. I hate it. It is junk. I'm sorry, but it just is not good compared to newer options like the Microsoft Surface Laptop 7 has an amazing.
And I have to say that those things are exactly where, to me, like value comes in, right? We talked about like the much better screen in many ways. Though it doesn't give you the same peak brightness, it is usable in terms of brightness. And then, of course, it gives you 120 hertz, the pixel by pixel contrast of OLED, right? So it definitely wins. But then you have all those little things like the USB-C ports are USB-C, not actually Thunderbolt. There is no like modern like charging connector and stuff like that. The trackpad is crap. The keyboard is mid. The chassis is not sturdy at all, and the speakers are crap in comparison to the MacBook. The microphones are worse, but doesn't matter that much. The camera is slightly better, whatever, right? And in that regard, I'm like, oh, so the screen is better, but everything else surrounding it is worse. And this is where I stop kind of caring about the screen, right? Tipper Master asking, what do you think of the rumors that thinness is returning post-IVE? I believe it, but I believe it in ways that people don't quite understand. Not because I'm super smart, but because I run this channel with now over 150 videos on it, so I cover things in more nuanced ways than even often like dedicated news channels, unfortunately. Which is, look at, and I often bring this up. Boop, 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 boop. Can we go to, I'll just go to apple.com directly. Go to iPad, the iPad Pro. We go to its tech specs. There it is. So we have a 5.1 millimeter thick product here and a 5.3 millimeter thick 11-inch iPad Pro. And we do have a weight reduction that went from around 1.5 pounds to around 1.3. This is about keeping the same weight actually as the previous generation, technically even a small reduction. But this one actually has a larger battery capacity by almost 10% versus the M2 iPad Pro 11-inch. On the 13-inch iPad Pro, we do get a small like 4% reduction in battery capacity, but we also gain a much more efficient screen. Well, this goes from LCD, which doesn't really give you like super high like HDR capabilities or whatever, to tandem OLED. This one goes from mini LED to tandem OLED. And while mini LED can be more efficient than LCD if there's like a lot of black stuff that can be turned off, in general, it will actually consume more power than your traditional LCD panel. So that explains some of the battery discrepancy here. Then there are some small internal changes here that make it a slightly more sturdier around this, basically around the center. It improves the cooling a little bit. It uses graphene heat dissipation covers, and it uses like a copper Apple logo to improve like cooling on the device by 20%. But you also get the benefit over like an iPhone with a glass back. This is a full-on aluminum product. So that heat from like the Apple logo, you don't just get the benefit of it being copper, you also get the benefit of now the copper dissipating the heat better to the surrounding aluminum chassis. Now, this is how you got a thinner iPad Pro. You went from a somewhat thickish LCD or very thick mini LED to a super thin tandem OLED. You gained efficiency advantages from a lot to mega a lot of efficiency, and you got small internal changes to basically deal better with stuff like heat, and then batteries that were adjusted accordingly to needs, increasing in one because now you actually had more internal space, and slightly reducing in other because you just made it even more thinner, right? If this was 5.3 millimeters, this could actually have the same battery capacity as before. If this was the same 6.4 millimeters as before, it probably could have had a 25% larger battery or something without any problems. So this is how Apple made the iPad Pro a lot thinner. Now let's look at a comparable device that could get a lot thinner in some ways, not in all ways. Let's look at the MacBook Pro. And when you actually look at the design, they usually here. This is the laptop lid, right? The display cover. This is already thicker than it was in the past, right? If you think about the 13 and 15-inch MacBook Pros with Intel chips, before the era of 1080p webcams and before the era of mini LED screens on MacBooks, those laptop lids were a lot thinner. I believe tandem OLED can make this thinner, better, and then Apple can keep around the same camera quality, right? So that's already one thing. Now you have to consider stuff like battery. Now, I'm not advocating for Apple to actually reduce battery capacity inside, but tandem OLED, as I said, is way more efficient than mini LED. So once you go from like a 72 watt hours, that's on the M Pro MacBook Pro, or around 70 watt hours on the base M MacBook Pro, you could realistically go to like 62, like a 10% reduction, and keep the absolute same battery life with screen on, right? Now, if you would ask, well, what if I'm using an external monitor? Well, if you're using an external monitor, you're likely charging your Mac simultaneously as well, so I wouldn't worry about that much. But the other consideration I would say is that M4 is already showing a lot of efficiency advantages over M3. And then, of course, once we go like with 2 nanometer on M6 or something like that, that will be more efficient still. And don't forget that by the time we get stuff like OLED MacBook Pros in late 2026 or early 2027, all of those technologies will have moved forward, right? Not only will we have like a 2 nanometer chip by then, but we'll have like tandem OLED that might be like even 10-15% more efficient than the first generation on the iPad Pro. So this is how I believe Apple could cut down the laptop lid by like 20-25% in thickness, and maybe the rest of the chassis by 5-10%, and that will result in an overall reduction in thickness by like 7% or something like that. And then of course there are other technologies, but you would have to watch one of my previous videos where I went more into detail about like stacked batteries, right? You could actually keep the same battery capacity but make it noticeably volumetrically smaller, and now you could potentially reduce the chassis size by another 10%. And also with cooling, Apple could use more advanced like vapor chamber heat sinks they don't actually reduce like the weight that you need for cooling, but Apple could build them in more space efficient ways. And this is how I believe we'll get thinner devices, not because Apple suddenly will be okay by cutting battery life by 30% or something like that. I believe they will make the necessary compromises to deliver about the same battery life as right now, but give you a nicer screen and a slightly lighter, smaller device. And then I think on something like the 16-inch MacBook Pro, they could actually still go crazy and keep like a 100 watt hour option, and then say like, well, but this is just for the Max chip and whatever, right? And then charge more for it. This is how I believe we'll go thin, not by somehow getting a way worse experience. Those days, in my opinion, are over. Johnny Ive is not in charge anymore. The person who took over from Johnny Ive isn't even in charge anymore. John Turnus takes those Pro devices very, very seriously. Those are kind of his baby. He was like the lead on Apple's like Pro workflow team and stuff like that, actually working with developers and prosumers. So yeah, this is how I believe we'll go thin.
Amazing trackpad that's no longer a diving board design. And now jumping into performance, I want to do a quick battery life checkup, and surprisingly, the Samsung's at 92%, while the MacBook's at 91%. So somehow the Samsung is winning. Wow, X Elite chip on basically standby, doing well so far.
Wait, what did you even do? How did the Mac lose 10%? Okay, this is okay. This was like a weird thing. How long did it take you to film this? Tippomaster saying, you think the same way as me, part of it will be the OLED stack is simply thinner. Chassis is probably slightly overbuilt for Apple Silicon after the Intel throttling issues. Exactly. I think that you also have to understand the chassis is built for the Macs, right? Because in theory, like even the 14-inch chassis has to house like an M Max processor. Now, Apple could legit go crazy and create a super varied lineup where they have a different chassis for the M Pro and the M Max variants, or they could do something super specific, like maybe get rid of Max chips on the 14-inch version. I don't think they'll do that. I'm just spitballing here. And then only give it to the 16-inch and then really be able to redesign the 16-inch just in mind with that and redesign the 14-inch just in mind for the Pro variant.
Right here on the Samsung with the 1TB SSD. This MacBook Air actually has a 512, so the write speed should be slower. This is technically the $1,700 version. Of course, it's $1,900 if you get 1TB, so it does become more expensive.
Again, I do want to remind you guys, those Macs have been out there for like months and months. You can get crazy discounts, like 10% is not even like uncommon at all, and 15% is possible.
Spec, so let's run this. It looks like the Book4 Edge is about 250 megabytes per second faster in terms of...
Those are margin of error. This is basically the limits of the bus, the PCIe lanes. If it's like 2 PCIe 4 lanes or if it's like 4 PCIe 3 lanes, that's about the limit.
The read speed, but in terms of the write, the MacBook's about 140 faster, so they're really, really close and both fast enough. And now let's jump into Geekbench 6. You can see both of these have 16 gigabytes of RAM.
Wait. The only thing I want to see, what about random speeds?
Now let's jump into Geekbench 6. You can see both get 1TB, so it does become more expensive if they're similarly spec'd.
Because it's EUFS. Yeah, look, this is the stuff that Vadim doesn't really cover for some reason. Like here's random read. Now I don't know why random write is bad here on the Macs, but like look at the difference in random read, which is very, very important for like a lot of like very general device stuff, because you basically have to sometimes conjure up data that is already on your SSD, and that is 2.5 times faster here. Now I have no idea why the Mac is 4 times slower in random writes, so I couldn't tell you that, but those are slightly weird numbers to me. I don't know why. And then you have like the discrepancy here between like, wait, what is this? This is sequential, but this is right. Oh, this is like one. Oh my God. You see, now I cannot really evaluate that because I should do some research in what the difference between this individual sequential speeds are. But this looks like this is a right thing. Huh. Like if this was a read thing, I would just say, oh, it ran out of like the faster storage that you have on the SSD, basically, like almost like cache. Those are weird results, guys, don't you think? What do you think of those numbers? Like, because this to me, this is what I expected to see, because it's EUFS, where I expected that random storage performance would be worse than NAND, which by the way also means that the storage in here is dirt cheap for Samsung. But I didn't expect the differences here in write, nor the differences here in random, nor the difference here in sequential. So yeah, I have no idea what this test did. Those are different tests, right? Are they? Like, because this is Crystal Disk and this is Amorphous Disk Marc. Yeah, I should be doing more storage tests. Maybe I will like run those tests on my MacBook and see how it performs. But like somebody in the chat recently said like, oh, random performance matters more to you. Like my question here is like, which random performance then are we talking about? Are we talking about the one where Mac wins by a lot, or where like the X Elite wins by an embarrassing margin over the Mac? So yeah, it's very weird. And then you have like 6x difference here in this sequential write test. No idea what happened.
Looks like the Book4 Edge is about 250 megabytes per second faster.
And this is where I dislike MaxTech guys, because I know that they test a lot, right? They run all of those tests, but they never question their results, where I'm like, bro, you have 3 or 4 results in there that aren't as simple to say as what you're doing with the sequential test, right?
In terms of
but you still only present the sequential test and basically making the evaluation, oh, they're exactly the same. They're not. Yeah, Amorphous' port of Crystal Disk Miner. Oh, that's good to know. And you were the one who suggested it to Max and started using it. Well, congrats to that. But you have to line up the test to be the same. Okay. But do you think that those results actually like mean much? Like, will they impact like regular performance that much? Like, I have a 1 terabyte M1 Max MacBook Pro. I am fine. Like I know my random speeds could be higher, but sequentials are amazing. I don't give a frick the way I use my device at that point. But in this case, given that those are like lower power devices and you kind of want a lot of tasks to be like quickly over, right? You don't want to really stress the SSD or whatever. And then there's also the question like you will sometimes more often have to stress the SSD for like a swap from memory. Versus like I have a 32 gigs of RAM device, or even on a 16 gigs of RAM device, you will have to do swap sometimes. So yeah, I'm just a little confused by those numbers, especially since Vadim didn't bother with explaining them.
More expensive if they're similarly spec'd, so let's run this. It looks like the Book 4 Edge is about 200, it's about 140 faster, so they're really, really close and both fast enough. And now let's jump into Geekbench 6. You can see both of these have 16 gigabytes of RAM. We have the Apple M3 on the right, and we have the best SKU of the X Elite. Yes, that's the 84 SKU that clocks up to 4.2 gigahertz dual core boost. So this is
and there is, as I said, the 1DE version that clocks up to 4.3 gigahertz.
Laptop that you can get the best chip in. So let's run the CPU test. We have our scores and look at that. The MacBook has over 3,000 points in single core, so it's 8.5% faster than the Book 4 Edge with the X Elite 84 SKU, but
at a lower frequency, so the IPC is definitely higher on the Mac, by the way. This one clocks at 4.08 gigahertz. This is 4.2. This is 8% faster, despite being like 5% lower clocked. And yeah, this is the weird thing about the Galaxy Book 4 Edge, where it gives you like not full multi-threaded performance, even in its best performance mode, but it gives you, I believe, about all its performance once you plug it in. Obviously, on the Mac, you don't really have to worry about that. You do get your 1150 to 12,000 results, whether you're plugged in or not. But yeah, if you look at this, I would say that those are like functionally the same in many ways.
This Samsung is quite
because like a little bit more single core, a little bit less multi-core. I think if the system is tuned very well, then you can basically get the same results out of those. Now again, I do want to mention this uses substantially less power. So if you are just making the comparison between the X Elite and the base M, that makes no sense. This consumes way less power.
Faster in terms of multi-core, 14.5% faster to be exact. Now, keep in mind, this is on battery power with best performance enabled. You can see it right here. And of course, this machine does get quite a lot faster, over 15,500 points if you plug it into power. But because the main selling point of the X Elite chip is battery life, I'm gonna test everything on battery power, because what's the point of buying one of these X Elite laptops if you have to be plugged in to get the full performance? So we're
That's
testing
correct.
it
At that
like
point,
this.
you should definitely get like a Strix point device.
Keep in mind, you can get more performance if you plug in. And now I want to test Speedometer 3.0, which is basically going to test the performance of web browsing snappiness and web-based apps as well. And by the way, we have the optimized Safari on the MacBook, and we have Edge on the Book 4 Edge. We got the scores, 36.1 for the Mac, 26.5 for the Samsung. That's 36% faster for this MacBook Air. Let me actually test Chrome on both as well. And it looks like with Chrome, the X Elite is a little bit faster, 28.2, but the MacBook also got faster, 38.7, 37% faster than the Samsung. And now let's test web design performance using Figma. And this, by the way, is a project provided to us by 500 Designs, the best design studio in Cali. And the first thing I want to do is test out the loading speed. So I'm going to zoom in right here, see how long it takes. I mean, look at that. I mean, it looks pretty dang good to me. Nice and sharp. Let's do the same thing on this guy right here.
That was even
Like
smoother.
that. High quality, nice, loaded up quickly. And now let's go ahead and export 12 layers.
Do you think M4 could be eked above 4K single core in a Mac with higher power limits. I don't think the base M4 could, but I think the M4 Pro or M4 Max could potentially, like if you get it to 4.6 gigahertz or something like that in a high power mode, maybe one that only works if you're plugged in or something like that, or maybe let's just say it's completely exclusive to the Macs because the Macs chips also have better cooling. I believe that you can definitely get the architecture to go to 4K. It's just that I don't think that it's needed. I think that there will be massive efficiency losses once you try to reach that. Well, technically, you would only even need to put it at 4500, right? Like megahertz, because like even at 4.4 gigahertz, it still reaches like up to 3,900 points. It just has to like have the power and the cooling to get there. And with 4.5 gigahertz, that's like 2% more. That would probably be sufficient, and definitely at 4.6 gigahertz. So, but I don't think that it really matters to Apple. You just have to consider that if you clock the CPU higher, that also affects the cache. The cache is shared between like CPU, GPU, neural engine. That means you now have to consider the overall stability in communication. If you add more performance, you have to find the bandwidth to actually drive that performance. That bandwidth can be internal cache, memory bandwidth, etc. And I just don't think that affecting all those other components on the SoC in a negative way is in any way what Apple is looking forward to. Again, they did that in the past with the high power mode on the M2 Max versions, but I don't think that they are interested in that anymore.
See which one finishes first. And there you go, they're finished, and it looks like the MacBook took 1 minute and 36 seconds, while the Book 4 Edge with the X Elite took 1 minute and 49.
What could happen, it depends on the L2 cache layout and whatever, like basically, or in general, cache that is shared between the CPU cores themselves, so not like the system level cache where also the GPU has access, but the cache only for the CPU. If you could get one core to use all the cache on like an 8-core or 12-core performance core cluster, then you could really get it to perform even higher. But usually, if you have a lot of cores, you don't get like one core cluster with 12 performance cores. You would get like 3 quad-core clusters or 2 6-core clusters. So I wouldn't even know if that could work. But maybe if Apple scales up the M Pro or the M Max that way, so that cache could be funneled toward a single core result, then it could theoretically, even without higher clock speeds, give you a higher IPC and then give you those benefits. But again, that's just spitballing. I'm not an architect myself, like a chip architect, nor am I really like even interested in like 2% performance gains once you reach those high numbers. It's just showing off at that point. The M5 will do that. It doesn't matter if M5 is on N3P or if it's on N2. It will definitely either clock a little higher or have higher IPC, and then it will give you 4K.
Seconds, so 13 seconds longer, but still both of them are very quick in snap.
Okay, so what's the result?
13 seconds longer.
Wait, the MacBook Air 1? I always ask, what this is just like, this seems like the difference from the single core. Does this really not utilize more cores or the GPU? That's a little bit a shame.
1 minute and 49 seconds, so 13 seconds longer, but still both of them are very quick and snappy. And now let's do a quick graphics test. This is 3D Mark's Steel Nomad Lite, which is their newest, latest, most modern gaming benchmark that takes advantage of this modern hardware. Let's do the unlimited mode. So this is running, and I just noticed something very annoying on the Samsung. The fans are running loud, and I'm hearing this high-pitched...
It's coil whine. I've seen that on other reviews for the Galaxy Book4 Edge. That's what you get from a cheaply made product. You get shit like coil whine that annoys you.
Coil noise. Do you guys hear that? That is extremely annoying. So the MacBook Air finished. We have 25% 12.1 FPS. Let's see what the Book 4 Edge gets. The Samsung's done, and it has just over 17.
That was, by the way, that is not like an exclusive like Windows problem or whatever. Like Intel MacBooks had that too. Usually you get coil whine if like your power supply is like not really up to snuff, or it's just not very well built and stuff like that. It's really a really annoying sound whenever you have to deal with that. And whenever I pay over $1,000 for anything, I kind of expect those kind of things to not be there. And especially in anything that approaches 2K, and granted, whenever I pay 3K for my MacBook Pro, then it's an absolute no-go. I would legit go back to the Apple Store and give back my MacBook if I had that.
FPS, so it looks like the M3 chip has 46% more FPS in this.
Yep. This is why I've been trying to tell people, are they going to test stuff like Wildlife Extreme? That 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme is a garbage test that has been giving the wrong impression of Apple Silicon performance literally for years across the A series chips, across the M series chips. And now we suddenly have this where it's like, oh, Apple is not actually like 2 generations behind Qualcomm when it comes to GPU performance on the iPhone. You mean the actual games are more representative of GPU performance than 3D Mark Wildlife? Yeah, and yeah, obviously on the Mac, this is where we get like 50% more.
Test, which is a realistic gaming benchmark. So the crazy thing is, I wouldn't even recommend the M3 chip if you want to do gaming. You got to get at least the M3 Pro and definitely the M3 Max if you're serious.
No, I think most people can actually be happy with, like, let's say the full version of M3 Pro, because you have to understand there are other advantages from going with a smaller die on a device. You get more efficiency in general, and yeah, I think a lot of people can be happy with the M Pros.
This is quite a lot slower, so this is definitely not a gaming laptop. It's more a thin and light web browser and maybe a little bit of CPU press.
Yeah, but now you're talking about like a 40% difference. You have to understand, when we are talking about like dedicated GPUs, usually whenever there's like a 20% jump in performance, and there are 20% jumps in performance, right? Because 20% jumps are 44% or 46, like in this case, I believe it was. You charge disproportionately more, right? You pay like 20%, you get 20% more performance, but usually for 20% more performance, you would pay, let's say, 25% more money. In the best case, if you're talking NVIDIA, you're more paying like 30% more. And that's before you consider differences like RAM and things like that. Sometimes you just need more RAM because more power would also like kind of necessitate more RAM for like higher quality textures and whatever. So you have 2 jumps here, like basically 2 intergenerational jumps, right? And this is when you go basically from a 4060 to a 4070 to a 4080. Now, I'm not saying you have to pay as much years for the differences there, because obviously the chips are much smaller and all those things. But generally, like, ignore the screen, right? Everything else being equal, better trackpad, better keyboard, magnificently better speakers, Thunderbolt versus USB, much better built chassis, microphones, all those small quality of life things, and a CPU that like loses in multi-threaded, wins in single-threaded, so you can even draw about even. By the end of the video, we'll also have a conclusion on battery life, but I can already tell you this in general has better battery life. And now you have 40% more GPU performance, like a real transformational difference, not just for games, but also if you're doing anything from like 3D CAD work, stuff like that. This is why, for example, when Jan Niklas was earlier asking us, like, should he go from an M2 Pro, and again, an M2 Pro will outperform in base M3 in terms of graphics performance. It has a lot more bandwidth, things like that, a lot more GPU cores. course. It just doesn't have like the latest like ray tracing capabilities, for example. And now you have to ask yourself, well, what do I do now? Because it looked like everything was sort of speaking for it, because it has like this large OLED screen, and maybe multi-threaded performance looked really, really attractive. But now I have like 2 steps removed in terms of GPU performance. How do I treat that? Right? Especially if once I upgrade storage and RAM, the prices are still not too far behind and not too different. And if I consider that there are like 15% reductions on price here, or at least 10% reductions on Amazon relatively regularly, like at that point, wouldn't I consider an M3 Pro that is just better than this in every way, but with a small price reduction from Amazon, and maybe with the acceptance of having to go with 512 gigabytes rather than 1 terabyte, at which point, by the way, even 512 gigabytes on the M3 Pro is way faster than 1 terabyte is on here, right? What do you do then? That's my question. Because when a lot of like, I understand the argument for like the VivoBook S15, right? That's $1,300, 16 gigs of RAM, 1 terabyte of storage, OLED 120 hertz, case closed. It's in raw hardware, even if it loses in things like battery life and speakers, keyboards and trackpads versus the MacBook Air, those things still matter, and it's way, way cheaper once you get the MacBook Air to those kinds of RAM and storage levels. But this is where I'm like really like wondering, wait, now what are you paying for? You are paying for the fully enabled X Elite, like the 84-100 version, which isn't even technical the highest end X Elite you can get. And now you have to deal with all that crap, like it not even beating the Air and everything. I don't know, guys. That to me would just scream either buy a Mac, right? Or wait for for devices that have like Strix point, because at that point you will be so far ahead of what this device enables, especially when it comes to GPU. It's not even funny. That's just my perspective.
Laptop. And speaking of CPU performance, let's jump into Cinebench 2024 to test the multi-core performance. Let's just start with a single run to start. And holy smokes, the fan is going insane on this laptop.
It's not a very well balanced fan, right? The sound that you can hear from it is it's not necessarily high pitched in a coil vine way, but you can really almost feel the movement, which if you actually if you actually use premium laptops, you know that their fan blades are like designed in a slightly asymmetrical way. That way, not every like fan blade creates actually the same frequency of noise. And when you use something that is like less good, and sometimes those fans even have like little ridges across the blade so that the air moves around in like slightly unpredictable ways, not in ways that like will make the physics work, but will make the sound much less predictable, much less uniform. And well, one might sound, well, why would I want a less like predictable or less uniform sound? Well, the problem is those sounds like accumulate. If you have a lot of sounds of one frequency happening simultaneously, those almost add up to you in experience. If you're using a well-made fan in a device, and again, the MacBook Air is fanless, you shouldn't be able to hear it in this way. This was a little bit of a technical tangent. You can call me out if I'm completely full of crap, but that's how I see it.
We have no fans on the MacBook Air, so it's not going to be able to stay as cool. And wow, guys, I cannot believe this difference. The Samsung got 969 points compared to 592 on the 15-inch M3 MacBook Air. That makes this X Elite 64%.
Can we now get a power consumption metric here? But also like Cinebench, as I said time and time again, Cinebench 2024 is better for ARM chips than Cinebench R23 was. Cinebench on Windows is better than Cinebench on Mac. Apple does not specifically optimize for Cinebench. I don't know how you ever believe, given all those other tests that you can run, that there's actually a 60% advantage in multi-threaded performance. That's just so like unbelievable.
Faster in this test, despite only being 14.5% faster in Geekbench 6's multi-core test. And that is probably, of course, due to this MacBook Air being fanless, which is its biggest downside in terms of long-term.
I have fully grown to accept that fanless is kind of the right thing for the base M series chips. I'm not a huge fan actually of the $1,600 M3 MacBook Pro. I think, for one, I dislike it having 8 gigs of RAM, but also like I dislike it having still like PCIe 3 storage speeds versus like the PCIe 4 storage speeds you can get on the M3 Pro. I think once you have fans, once you have 70 watt-hour batteries, I think you kind of want to pair that with something in the class of an M2 Pro, M3 Pro, not in the class of the base M. At that point, like a lot of people blame the MacBook for being fanless, but that's not really the case. You should really blame it more for the fact that it has like a super thin aluminum cooling layer that has barely any copper in it. I believe barely any or no graphene. So it is like architecturally, from a cooling perspective, let's forget the raw amount of cooling. It's behind what the M4 iPad Pro is doing, which finds like creative ways to add more cooling. I believe if this one like had a lot, like just a thin copper layer or like a mix of copper and graphene going across the chassis here, it would, well, even if it performed the same, it would outperform basically a lot of fan-based devices. Apple is not going cheap on cooling here because they didn't put in a fan. Apple is going cheap on cooling here because they didn't put in a lot of copper and graphene. And in fact, they could be even putting in more aluminum, even though freaking aluminum thin, like heat dissipation layer is super thin. No, I don't want full screen. That just doesn't work.
GPU workloads. Now, I really wanted to test the GPU benchmark within Cinebench 2024, but it looks like the X Elite cannot run
compatibility problems. This is why, when we go back to like what Jan Nicholas were saying, for like, I have no idea what like an app like a function like Docker will do on like the X Elite. I honestly don't know.
Blender. Here we have the Party Tug project on both. I have cycles set on both, and I do want to mention that Blender is not native with the X Elite chip right now. So you can see it's an x86 app, which means it is going to be emulating, and other reviewers have said that the emulation loses about 10 to 15% performance.
Yeah, it depends. It definitely loses, I would say, sometimes more than that when it comes to CPU limited stuff. GPU limited stuff probably comes in about 10 to 15%. But whenever we are talking about GPU stuff, you also have to consider that you will hit like very weird issues if you have like even small compatibility issues in stuff like games. Games, you might even get like a decent average FPS in a benchmark, but then you look at the actual game and it's a stuttering mess because it has completely unstable frame times. So in my opinion, at least in general, the compatibility layer, I wouldn't evaluate it on a raw like, oh, does it give you 80 to 85 to 90% of the final performance? I would evaluate it, well, how many apps are actually fully compatible thanks to that translation layer? How does GPU acceleration look like? As we've seen, it struggles in an app like Cinebench, right? This was what was so good about Rosetta on the Intel to Apple Silicon transition, is that it actually worked really, really well right out of the gate.
And if I go into the settings, I want to mention that the GPU acceleration is not working because, well, I guess it's not native and nothing's working, so it might even be defaulting to the CPU, whereas the M3 chip is going to be using the full Metal RT ray
I mean,
tracing.
you should test probably both, I would say, at that point. Test out the Mac for CPU, give a small win to the X Elite, and then decimate it by using Metal.
GPU acceleration. Let's see what we can get in terms of performance. All right, they're finished rendering, and holy smokes, guys, there's a huge difference. The Book 4 Edge with the X Elite finished in 7 minutes and 35 seconds compared to 2 minutes and 37 on the M3 MacBook Air. That's basically a third of the time.
Yeah.
I can't believe it. 3 times faster. That's probably due to the ray tracing.
And this is why I'm telling you. Well, no, the ray tracing on the... Well, I'm not actually sure about the Adreno GPU and the X Elite, but at least the one on the Snapdragon Edge Gen 3 is pretty decent. When it comes to the advantage, this is GPU versus CPU rendering. But this is where I'm telling you, when you're looking at something like this done fast and efficiently, you honestly cannot go much better than the M3 Pro, right? MacBook Pro right now. Or you have to get an NVIDIA GPU because their ray tracing capabilities are so amazing that even on 4 nanometer, because of how well like the optics API and stuff like that are optimized, it will be actually even more efficient than like Apple's 3 nanometer SoCs. Now that is more of a blender thing, to be honest, but you at some point you cannot really argue with the facts of life. You have to accept them as they are.
And the GPU acceleration, which is not working on this machine. And of course, you have x86 emulation. And I did confirm that it's not using GPU at all. It's using the CPU, but it was limited to only 74% utilization for some reason. Same with the RAM, it wasn't being utilized. So something is throttling this machine, and I'm not sure what it is. But with that said, if you're doing something like Blender 3D rendering, you probably don't want to get the X Elite for that. But now let's test something that is ARM64 native, which is the regular version of Lightroom right here on the Samsung. You can see ARM64.
We saw like
So
that
what I have right
benchmark
here
with an 8
is
gigabyte
50,
MacBook
42
Air.
megapixel
There it
images
was
set up
slower.
on both
Now
these.
let's see.
So let's test out the snappiness and how quickly it loads up before we export them. All right, let's click right. And it looks like both of them are loading pretty quickly. Nice and quick on the Samsung. Keeping up very well.
Like the problem is this was already fast on like M1, right? This was already fast on like 3 generations old Intel chips. Like scrolling between it's kind of the same thing as when people are like saying, how fast is your smartphone? And they then scroll through like a website. I'm like, bro, I could scroll smoothly through websites, I would say on the A7 chip, right? Can we please stop with that garbage, right? Hell, even the A5 was decent unless it was like something super big like the New York Times back in the day. Like I remember when Steve Jobs was actually using like New York Times on stage to like see how quickly it loads. But like moving between like 50 megapixel images, it's just like, It's not really like that demanding for modern CPUs.
The only downside is I can hear the fans already. We got the same output settings on both. JPEG small, 90%. We have screen output sharpening set to standard. Everything's the same. Let's go ahead and export. And wow, I was not expecting this. Even without GPU acceleration, the Book 4 Edge finished in 1 minute and 16 seconds compared to 1 minute and 42 on the M3 MacBook.
Didn't he say in the last video that the M3 performs in like 1 minute and 4 seconds in if it has 16 gigs of RAM? What happened to that? I thought this was the kind of result like 2 minutes was that you got on an 8 gigabyte system. What happened? This is why I wish, like, I hope that Gamers Nexus or like Hardware Unboxed soon tests out the X Elite so that we have a lot of like very comprehensive benchmarks where I'm sorry, but the reviewers need to know a little bit more about tech and the actual test that they're running, and they have to keep in mind like previous results versus sometimes the Max Tech guys, they're like, oh, look at this result. And I'm like, wait, but this makes no sense in the context of the old result that you have given me.
Air, so that is actually very, very fast. This CPU is working so well. And just in case you're curious, I have Lightroom Classic right here, which is going to be emulated in x86 app with the X
different
Elite,
versions
so we can see
of
how much performance
Lightroom?
you lose if it's not native. I'm going to change the settings to exactly what, and wow.
Native Lightroom
versus
versus Lightroom Classic. Oh, okay. So I guess that explains the discrepancy.
Native version, which is going to be emulated in x86 app with the X Elite, so we can see how much performance you lose if it's not native. I'm going to change the settings to exactly what we had in the native version. We have quality 90, we have sharpen screen standard on both. Let's see what we get. And look at that. The funny thing is that the scores actually switched a little bit. The M3 now took a minute and 18 seconds,
yeah, this
so
is
it got a performance
this is
boost.
why I'm asking, why are you like, is this new Lightroom version better? Like, what is different on the Mac version? Why, like, is this a worse version of Lightroom that performs better? Is this a better version of Lightroom? Did I somehow like, well, what is Lightroom Classic supposed to be? Like, Lightroom Classic. Is that like World of Warcraft Classic? Adobe Lightroom. Download Lightroom Classic. Lightroom Classic versus Lightroom. Lightroom is the new cloud-based photo service that works across desktop, mobile, and web. Lightroom Classic is the desktop focused digital photography product. Okay, that tells me absolutely nothing. Which is better, Lightroom Classic or Lightroom? If you want photos stored in the cloud so you view and edit them on device, then use Lightroom. If you want to provide your own keywords, you would use Lightroom Classic. Of course, there are other differences. What differences are you concerned about? Lightroom Classic is more for professional use, while Lightroom CC is more for on-the-go editing. Well, but Lightroom CC is like the mobile version, right? Okay, this is like a German explanation. Lightroom. So apparently the new Lightroom is very cloud-based. But that doesn't mean it's like not natively rendered, right? Lightroom Classic, it's full control on the desktop. Okay, I no idea, to be honest, guys. Does anybody of you know? Andre de follow. Lightroom Classic uses local files, while regular Lightroom can use local files, but majority of the time uses your cloud files unless you specifically to only use local files. Well, thank you, Andrew. But is there like a different like editing, is there a noticeable difference in editing capabilities? Is there more functionality inside Classic? Because for now, this looks basically a little bit more like, you know what this looks like to me? This looks a little bit like the fight between Final Cut on Mac versus Final Cut on iPad. Enzo Boito joining the chat, the guy who used to call me Apple Sheep before I got a haircut. Welcome to the stream, my brother. We do have quite a couple of people watching. Before I slowly transition out of the stream, I still want to encourage you guys to do all the YouTube jazz, as I call it. Please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share the video, comment both while I'm live, but also when the video has already been uploaded. And as always, please, if you have the money, if you feel like doing it, leave a small donation in the form of a super chat. Big shout out again to Max Maximus, who already left a donation before the stream went live because he couldn't watch live. Or you can do it with a super chat or a super sticker, or you can support this channel directly in the long term by subscribing to my Patreon.
In Lightroom Classic, while the X Elite slowed down to 1 minute and 31 seconds, which is honestly still very fast and impressive, even with emulating x86. So I'd say it still works just fine in emulation. Whew. All right, guys, that was a bunch of performance testing. So with all of that said, it's time to do the final battery life test before I jump into my conclusion and my thoughts. Let's look at the X Elite Book 4 Edge. What do we have? 40% battery life remaining. Wow, that's pretty good for all that testing. It's been a few hours of me filming this, and on the Mac, 48%. So the M3 15-inch MacBook Air is definitely better in terms of battery life. Keep in mind it does
I
have
would ask one question here, and that is, what was the display brightness setting, right? Because this kind of discrepancy, you have to normalize settings. If this was actually correct, that would mean that the X Elite is actually in just as efficient, if not more so, than the M3, and that doesn't line up with any other test, including from the Max Tech guys. So my suspicion here is that if we looked at the actual like nits coming from the screen, we are probably looking, maybe they maxed out the brightness fully. Like I believe in the beginning they showed like the brightness slider, but that doesn't mean it has to be normalized, right? Maybe this was 400 nits, this was 300 nits, maybe this was 500 nits, this was 400 nits. That would explain those small differences to me, because the MacBook Air should be pulling far ahead here.
A larger battery by about 19.5%, so that's quite interesting. Now, I do want to say that this is extremely impressive for the X Elite, especially considering the really, really good multi-core performance, because if this was an Intel x86 machine, this would have already been so low that I would have had to plug it in. It literally would have died after all this performance testing. So I've got to say, I am shocked and so glad that we finally have a good ARM-based chip in a Windows laptop with the X Elite. Overall, for snappiness, web browsing, multi-core CPU performance, especially in longer-term tasks like Cinebench, this thing is killing it. Absolutely amazing laptop right here with the X Elite chip. The only downside is, first of all, you have the lack of ray tracing. That's a downside.
It does not have a lack of ray tracing. It's just not supported here in Blender because it's a non-native version, and the APIs are crappily supported.
Extremely underwhelming. It is very, very weak. It's slower than the one in the M3, and I wouldn't even recommend.
This will mean it's actually slower than the one in the 10-core GPU version of the M2.
People to get the M3 for gaming or for rendering or anything else. We recommend the M3 Pro, M3 Max. So if you don't care about graphics, this is literally a game changer. Windows laptop people out there, you've got to get yourself one of these because it is absolutely amazing for a thin and
Okay, I think that's okay. I think the battery life in the end was honestly the most surprising thing. All the other results kind of line up with everything else that we have seen. The last thing I want to do is very, very quickly, I want to go through some results from this guy, the Phawx. He is really, really good. Now, I'm not obviously watching his entire video or anything here, but he has tested games. Probably maybe in the next video I could go through some of his other tests, like here for the VivoBook at least, he claims that it would have about 10 hours of like average usage battery life in his testing. I've seen some people disagree with that, but what is more interesting to me, we've obviously seen Cinebench at this point. He does make other statements too. Andrew saying, you apologize for the delay. There's no difference in Lightroom and Classic when it comes to how you can edit your photo. Okay, interesting. So I guess that's just like an Adobe weird thing where they decided they needed to make a separate app for cloud stuff, even though they probably could have integrated into one anyway.
The Snapdragon X Elite. Now I am running the x86 version of Cinebench R 2024, whereas we're running the ARM version of Cinebench R 2024 on the Snapdragon X Elite. So both of these are the native compiled versions for those respective platforms. However, I am still winning on AMD's 8840U using the same amount of power. So
yeah, okay. This is the first thing I wanted to discuss, because when you guys remember when we talked, now again, this is the kind of like full power efficiency, right? ARM in general is more efficient, like if you use it a little bit more, like not like an efficiency core, but when you use it at lower frequency, it seems to scale to those lower frequencies better. I don't know if that's an advantage of RISC architectures in general or how ARM has designed ARM over the years, but this is why when we looked at the benchmarks here for like Strix point and stuff like that, where was it? Right, the 8840U is basically in most ways like the 7840U, so you wouldn't have to worry about that. So if you matched about the X Elite with the 8840U, but you did it even with slightly less power, now you have to ask, well, if the Strix point-based thing is even only like 2 or 3% more efficient, right? Because it's the same node, it's a new architecture with better IPC, but IPC is not magical. You cannot always get more IPC without extra power consumption. AMD has made very few claims about efficiency for Zen 5, so let's see until we actually get final products. But to me, this is like, again, I don't think that Strix point devices will be able to replicate what we just saw with MaxTech's test, right? I absolutely believe that in that regard, AMD will still be behind ARM, I want to say, behind Qualcomm's X Elite. However, given a tiny bit of tuning, like maybe running this in balanced mode, benefiting from its better native compatibility, its better GPU. Really, my question comes up like, how much do you gain from having a little bit more battery life, which is what we saw here, right? A little bit more battery life than like the Intel systems, and the AMD systems perform very similarly. Right, that's what I'm asking. Like, how different will be actually your average user experience? Not like your benchmark, not like because this is also a benchmark, right? Like running one video at one fixed brightness level and turning off basically every system features is not really a test. Like in that regard, it's a benchmark. It's a battery benchmark, but it's a benchmark. While the average user experience will be more like what this guy said, it's coming out around 10 hours, which you can also achieve with I believe the 8840U would be Hawk point, right? And Strix points shouldn't be too much worse. So that's kind of my argument here, which is like you should, even if you consider the X Elite, even if you really like its battery life advantages, and I still believe even over Strix point in regular usage, it will win in battery life, but I do believe that you owe it to yourself to wait until like Strix point comes out, not just because it might be a lot better than the X Elite, but because it might then push down prices for X Elite products that are already on the market. If this sells better, it might force manufacturers and stores to try to get their X Elite products to people, reduce prices 10-15% and something like that, and then you benefit obviously a lot as a consumer, regardless of what your final decision will be.
Again, kind of what I want to kind of point out here is that while the laptop is very, very nice, it's not without reason that we can't also match power and performance on other platforms. There isn't any magic sauce to ARM here. It's just that you kind of have to do a little bit more work on x86 to actually flex that out of it.
Yep.
So that's one thing that I really want to kind of highlight here.
This will also be very interesting with Strix point, because right now Hawk point, the 8840U, consists only out of 8 performance cores or 8 Zen 4 cores. Strix point will have 8 efficiency or Zen 5C cores. So realistically, a lot of the time, it might be actually a lot more efficient than Hawk point, especially if the system will sometimes be smart enough to almost turn off the 4 performance cores, or just use maybe one of them for peak power, or for loading up one app, but then it keeps running on the efficiency cores. Is M4 better than X Elite? Yes, it is. It is at least 10% better in GPU than DM3, and we just saw DM3 outperform the X Elite by 46%. It is about 15 to maybe even 20% faster than the M3 in single core performance. And in terms of single core performance, the M3 already wins by 8 to 10%. In multi-threaded performance, it should be about equal with the X Elite, but it's significantly lower power consumptions. And then in general, it will use the fact that it's more efficient to give you longer battery life. Now, it might have some insufficiencies in other regards, like the amounts of ports it can have, though there is another rumor that I will cover in the future about like M4 having like double the Thunderbolt controllers of M3, so it might not actually be behind anymore. But yes, M4 is better than X Elite. M3 is in many ways better than X Elite, but not at all. And then in some tests, like maybe Cinebench multi-threaded, M4 would still be behind X Elite, but you won't see those numbers in like in most multi-threaded workloads. And again, also Cinebench, I always point out, Cinebench, as much as it has improved, not only is it still better on Windows than it is on Mac in general, but Cinebench is based on Cinema 4D, an app that professionals use almost exclusively with the GPU, not the CPU. So its actual relevance is highly dubious. Alex says saying false numbers. Well, bro, you have to say what you mean here. Like, you cannot just say false numbers. Are my numbers false? Are Phawx numbers false? Are Notebook Checks numbers false? Are MaxText numbers false? Are Tom's Hardware numbers false? You have to be more precise, brother.
Just so that you guys have a better understanding that there isn't any real secret sauce. It's just a matter of how you tune things.
Yeah.
That could also stand a reason that I don't really know how to tune everything on ARM either. So maybe I can get things better on ARM. Maybe ARM's just going to get better as more people look at it. There's still a lot of unknowns here, but right now with where we're looking at this particular review, it's not a silver bullet to all of your concerns and thinking that ARM is going to be the best performance at low power. It's just not the case insofar as what we're looking at right now. So with the CPU benchmarks out of the way, let's go ahead and go into the gaming benchmarks, which should solidify your understanding that this is not a gaming laptop. While it can game, this is not something that you would really look forward to for gaming purposes. Okay, the first gaming benchmarks that we're going to be taking a look at it.
Okay, so native ARM build Dolphin. Okay, that's an emulator for Wii and GameCube. So we have, this is performance mode with 15 watts of total system power for the X Elite. Oh, and that's the different modes basically that you get in the system. Okay, so let's see how that compares.
A native ARM application. This is going to be the Dolphin emulator, which is a GameCube emulator, and it is built for Windows on ARM. So it's a native ARM application that we'll be able to run here. I'm going to be running Super Monkey
And by
Ball
the
2.
way, the reason why it's built for Windows on ARM, let's be honest, it's because all those emulators had to be rebuilt for Mac on ARM thanks to Apple Silicon. So Qualcomm really has to give Apple a big thank you. Now, there is the advantage that obviously the X Elite does natively support Vulkan, while a lot of those emulators have to use like Molten VK to translate Vulkan draw calls basically or instructions to Metal. But the fact that this is on Windows on ARM is really good.
Here, the reason I chose Super Monkey Ball 2 is it's a very lightweight GameCube game. This is a game that can run on potatoes, and I was hoping that we could really highlight how efficient this chip is, but unfortunately, that's just not the case. Now, this may be a number of factors. I am running the Vulkan backend, and for what it's worth, that was the best backend that I've used. DirectX 12 wasn't as good, so ultimately I chose the Vulkan backend here. Now, perhaps there's just optimizations that need to happen on the Dolphin emulator itself, because there really isn't a whole bunch of Windows on ARM devices out there, so maybe it's just not getting enough love. But if we take a look at it, like we had talked about prior, just before we got into this benchmark section, this will be divided between performance mode and efficiency mode, and generally speaking, this is double the power. So if efficiency mode's at 8 watt, our performance mode's at 15 watt. If efficiency mode's at 19 watt, our performance mode is going to be at 38 watt. And I don't know why it lined up like that, but that's just how it is based on what I'm looking at. So we take a look at efficiency mode. If you just take a look at averages, right, on the performance mode, we see 59.9 FPS average.
This is also what I do want to cover in general. When it comes to gaming stuff, this is why I'm trying to tell people that average tests, average FPS tests, really are kind of outdated by many, many standards. 1% lows, 0.1% lows, or 0.2% low in this case. They really define the stability experience that you have with a game. At the beginning, I once thought the X Elite is aiming to M3 Pro, M4 Pro, but it isn't. No, just its GPU is absolutely incapable of reaching that. You have to understand, its GPU isn't even fully beating the 10-core version of the M2, unless maybe in ray tracing. When it comes to like M4, there's no way.
Seems like it's good. But even when we take a look at our 1%.
And Alex, you said it's false numbers, but where are you, man? Show us some receipts if you come like that.
FPS at 52.4,
Don't
you can actually feel stuttering every now and again. And this is present a number of times in a lot of different ways, even for regular PC gaming. They just kind of crop up periodically now and then. If we take a look at the average FPS for our efficiency mode, we're looking at 56.6 FPS average. Now, if you were just to look at the averages, you'd be like, oh, that's not too bad. But when you take a look at the 1 percentile FPS, this is where things get really, really bad. And the game is practically unplayable with how much skipping and jerking is going on.
Yep.
So this is something that I really wanted to see.
And also, like, now I don't know if that's true for Super Monkey Ball, but if you're playing sometimes older games, their in-game like logic will sometimes be bound to their FPS. So if you cannot reach like at least 30 stable FPS, the game might run like slower or faster. Like, well, it won't run faster unless you force it to, which you can in an emulator. But like this kind of stability really matters.
And hopefully this is really just about making better optimizations on the Dolphin emulator.
Yeah, I do believe this should perform better if it's properly made. But this is the issue, right? Why buy a Windows system that has to go through all of those extra optimization if you can buy an Intel system with better GPU, like Lunar Lake will definitely be faster in GPU than this, or if you buy AMD, which is faster in everything with Strix Point, but might be less efficient.
Right now, jumping into the gaming benchmarks, this is PC gaming benchmarks, so we're going to take a look at x86 games that were compiled for x86, but they're going to be running through the
Wait, but
Prism,
does he not compare it to
on the 0.2 percentile?
Oh, wait, does he not? Okay, he does compare it to other stuff. So at 38 watts, now this is obviously, it has to like run through a translation layer here, but versus Intel, the 155H at 25 watts, it's weird that it wins in like low percentiles. I assume the 30 FPS was like set at a limit for like VSync purposes.
It's beating it across the board, which is very impressive. But then again, Intel's Meteor Lake, especially on the MSI Claw, was absolute garbage. And even at 25 watt, we're only beating it on the FPS average. So effectively, FPS average wise.
Okay, that's a good test. That's the very first one where I'm like impressed.
We're getting 9.51 percentile, which is truly terrible. So comparing Cyberpunk 2077, which is a bad game to run on Meteor Lake in general, to Snapdragon is impressive from this particular angle. However, if we bring in AMD on here.
Yes, please.
Okay, so looking at AMD's 8840 platform.
This is why I've opened this video, because I knew he would have this kind of result. This is the 780M. This is the old, basically, GPU inside AMD's SoCs. Now you will be getting the 880M on Strix Point, which should be like 30-40% faster. And you can see the difference here. So yeah, I'm very, very happy that I've seen it. Will he expand that benchmark more? No. Seems like Windows on ARM's x86 translation is worse than... Yes, it's worse than Rosetta 2, but it is way better than it used to be. A lot of people also make the mistakes in like saying that like, oh, it's like, oh, the first time they're doing translation. That is not true. Look at the 8CX Gen 3 or whatever, the last, or SQ3. I've seen like weird naming differences there. For like those older Qualcomm chips on, even like on the Surface Pro 9. Yeah, though there were previously translation layers, it just took Microsoft like several years to finally bring them up to snuff. Rosetta was good from day one. More tests. Let's see how they look in the full benchmark version. So this is at 20 or 25 watts. This is Horizon Zero Dawn. Absolutely decimating, double the performance at max power consumption potentially of the X Elite. Now again, this is translated, so maybe this could potentially reach like 70 or 80 FPS, but you can also see like that huge discrepancy in 1 and 0.2% lows. Yeah, this is why I was really trying to tell you guys. I know people are saying, oh, this is not a gaming laptop, but we've seen it like in native tests, it underperforms M3s that much. How much do you think it will underperform and don't get me wrong, I know some games will like get native ARM ports, but not enough. If you want to have even a somewhat decent gaming experience on Windows, and don't forget, this is like 25 watts. You can still get a 780M to run at like 30 watts or something. So yeah, this looks bad for it. Don't forget, because the 780M is like in the 8840U, but also in the 7840U, which means that in theory you could like, this is like 2 generations old now, not 1 generation old, and this is 7500 megatransfers per second versus this is 8500 megatransfers per second. So if you actually gave this slightly faster memory, it would underperform it even more. And then once you go like to like ridiculous levels of efficiency at like 15 watts, now this one cannot even compete with that despite over double the power usage.
The 8840 for efficiency mode we're using.
So the Callisto protocol, again, we see huge, and here he actually is hovering above the numbers so we can see the percentage as well. Yeah, so huge discrepancy where even at 20 watts, it over doubles the performance of the X Elite at 24 watts. Now, this is total system power, so let's even say it's a lot less for the actual SoC, but it doesn't really matter because even if we go all the way up to 34 watts, it still doesn't compete. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, an older test, and test that was actually notorious for running really well on M1 Max through on M1 Max, right? CS, not X, through Rosetta, right? While this is how I don't know how much this is impacted by the translation layer, but you can see it just doesn't compete with even significantly lower power variants for AMD's Hawk Point. And of course, Strix Point will give you 40% more performance than this, which at that point you should probably set an FPS limit for efficiency, especially like on a device like the GPT Win. But it's just fun. Those gains are huge. I'm very YouTube Kulanchizi. If you are watching this video either right now or later, you left a comment on my last video recommending me I check out this video. Thank you. Those are the exact kind of gaming results I wanted to see, and I hope other, like maybe Hardware Unboxed does like an in-depth review on this and gives us even more games, even more settings presets, things like that. And does he test anything native though? Like, oh, Elden Ring, which you shouldn't run Elden Ring on something like that. So the last one here, because again, if I do want to check out this video again, I will do so. I might just even watch it by myself and write out the most important things, because obviously I do want to wrap this video up. But yeah, like again, looking at Doom Eternal here, performance mode on the X Elite
really highlights how deficient are so many handhelds that run Doom Eternal so much better than this. And when we think about 17 watts of total system power, even 25 watts of total system power,
wait,
the Steam Deck would get closer to 70, 80 FPS in this exact same setting. So the Steam Deck will trounce this really hard. It'll actually even go up to ultra settings and get somewhere close to like 60 FPS.
Yep, that's true.
So
this game runs really well on Steam Deck, and Steam Deck is significantly slower than the 7080M GPU we've talked about. It's like a generation older, and it's also like lower power.
Steam Deck is so much far beyond better than what the Snapdragon X Elite is in this, and it really highlights efficiency.
Why does he not give those numbers? That's the Snapdragon X Elite
in this, and it really highlights how deficient we are on the GPU part, insofar as what's available on this Asus laptop. So hopefully,
also I should notice that this is the VivoBook X Elite, so that's the 3.8 teraflops version, not the 4.6 teraflops. But even if we go back to these benchmarks and we add like 20% more, and potentially also with that, of course, boost power consumption, that won't help it really do anything. So yeah, in terms of gaming, if you even want to do gaming really occasionally, which I don't know why on Windows you wouldn't want to do some gaming, especially if you're in any way like also like a geek, maybe, right? Might not mean that every geek is like a gamer, but sometimes a game comes out that you might be interested in, and this is sad. Cyberpunk, he didn't put it in a chart, and then he just gives final conclusion. So that's basically it from the videos and articles I wanted to react to. I've had a guy ask me in my last video, why are you not testing it out yourself? What is this meta rant? I'm like, bro, I don't have the Snapdragon X Elite devices. I certainly don't have Strix point right now, so that's what I kind of have to do. That's how people cover politics, news, things like that. This is my format. This is my hobby. So I thank anyone who is tuning in to, I guess, listen to my meta rants on processors, Apple versus Windows, things like that. So I just thought that comment was funny. Guys, I think we saw some interesting results. I think overall, I was impressed by the battery life result in the MaxTech video. I've said some of my criticism where it might be slightly inaccurate in terms of if you really normalize the nits on the screen, but it definitely seemed like it was performing all right. Then I've said multi-threaded performance is definitely pretty good. It seems to line up pretty well with everything else we've seen. Better in Cinebench definitely than in Geekbench, but hey, every test has some validity. Translation layer, about 10 to 15% performance cost. Not game changing, but definitely if you are looking at something that also does GPU acceleration, or maybe it's a very complex workload, you might really struggle with that compatibility layer. In terms of gaming, I think I'm very confident right now in saying that it just sucks and that I wouldn't want to use it for gaming because of the translation layer, because of the variance of do I get the 8100 version, the 84100 version. Most devices don't even get the option to get the 84100. And then, of course, with all of this, there's still the question of how solid will be the long-term support from Qualcomm, from Windows, from third-party developers. So right now, I definitely can say one thing, and that is this is not an M1 moment for Windows, but it is going better than I think some people either feared or hoped. I've seen some Apple fanboys say that they basically hoped this would completely fail, that the translation layer would be complete garbage. This is not the case. But anybody who was saying, oh, this thing, I've had a Twitter discussion with a fanboy for the most part of the X Elite, or maybe just an Apple hater, and he was like, oh, bro, you were saying that there wouldn't be 80-watt devices with this chip. And I'm like, yeah, there still aren't, right? And oh, you were saying that they would be limited to 23 watts. I'm like, no, I just said that at 50 watts already, you see very, very poor performance scaling, right? Which is pretty good. That means that around 28 watts, you probably can get most out of it that you would probably want. But it's Windows. You do have competition already from stuff like Hawkpoint and even Meteor Lake around the 20 to 30 to 40 watt range. And then you can overclock those things or even just run them at higher power a lot better often. And then there's the discrepancy of, do you use a DGPU? Because even an RTX 4050 will decimate everything that we've seen here, especially if you want to do ray tracing and whatever, and then a 4060 will just be completely transformative. And at that point, I'm like, if Windows has all those things to offer to you, right? Very different power metrics, the ability to use dedicated GPUs, full-on native compatibility with hundreds and thousands of games through Steam, GOG, even the Windows Store, as terrible as it is, even the Epic Game Store, even as terrible as Tim Sweeney is, right? I just don't know if I can really recommend the X Elite. I certainly don't know if I can recommend it as a side grade or even an upgrade over an older Mac, at least not an Apple Silicon one. But even in the Windows space, where some people might say, well, all I want is finally better battery life or whatever, I still have to tell you, well, with a little bit of tweaking, you might actually come pretty close. Now, not with Meteor Lake, and probably not even with Hawk Point, which is what is out right now, but Strix Point is out in a month, and Lunar Lake will be out definitely still this year. And then next year, we are transitioning to Arrow Lake, brand new nodes by Intel, all those improvements. And then, of course, Apple does not just have M3, but also M4. And we are definitely getting M4 by the end of this year. So just a little bit like Penny for your thoughts. Just some considerations in my meta rants. I thank you guys all so much for tuning in, making the live chats very, very lively in the last few videos. That helps me be a better streamer. We are now at a collective it will be at around 7 hours. No, it should be close to 8 hours of collective streams about the 3 X Elite streams that I recently done. So I really put my heart and soul into it. I really thank anyone here who joined, who watched, who left a like, who chatted with me live, who left a chat afterwards. Thank you to anyone who even considers leaving a super chat. And as I said today, thank you to Max Maximus leaving a super chat before we went live. He will check out the video afterwards, as he said. As always, I do want to encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel. I do want to grow this community. As you see, at 100K subs, we still need more people actually watching live and interacting, because the YouTube algorithm is so weird. Sometimes we get like 50, 60 viewers. Sometimes we're as low as 7. So I really, really apologize. Thank you guys for tuning in and making those live streams what they should be, which is lively, interactive, communicative, sometimes hot-spirited. And of course, liking the video helps, sharing out the video helps, commenting when the video has been uploaded helps. And of course, if you want to do like Max Maximus did, leave a super chat, leave a super sticker, small donation. It's all very much appreciated. It gets reinvested right back into the channel. And beyond that, if you want to support this channel directly in the long term, you can find my Patreon link in the description below. However, I do want to encourage you guys to go to my Patreon, because there's also a free tier on there. So if you want to have a pipeline to talk to me outside of YouTube comments and Twitter, that's where my Patreon is. That's what it is for. And over time, I do want to create more opportunities for you guys to interact. Discord, maybe I will make even like a live call feature and things like that. But for now, I'm very happy that I figured out like my microphone and camera setup, and that my streams are working as well as they are. So thank you so much. It's been an amazing journey. I'll keep on covering everything basically, but as you guys know, I don't always have the time with work and everything. So I really appreciate having every stream be the best possible version of it. So with that, I want to also recommend you to tell me what you would like to see me cover next. If you follow me on Patreon or Twitter or whatever, or you just leave a comment here. I did that today with YouTube Kulanchisi, where I basically listened to his comment and suggestion for my last video. So if you want to suggest me what I should cover next, do it in one of those ways, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much again. This is Marc Tech, tuning out.